So...
One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, but not enough about the subject to know you're wrong.
So, Nikorama has been quite the ride, hasn't it? I don't think I really expected to be as emotionally charged as I was throughout its run, but I'm sure plenty of people could say the same. We were not expecting this to be the never-ending story of cartoon reviews, and yet, here we are. The Nikorama review series curated by Mr. Renner was more or less meant to be a marathon of individual reviews made to cover a majority of Nickelodeon's animated library. Quite a few entries were omitted mainly for time constraints, with the expectation that they'll be discussed in next year's edition. However, over the course of 3 months, dozens of reviews, hundreds of critiques, and one dramatic Twitter exit later, the status of the project as a reoccurring series was left in deep, deep limbo. Catty as it sounds, I'm actually a bit grateful we didn't get to the more obscure Nicktoons this time. Throughout the course of the 3 months spent releasing it, this series seems to be not the most well-organized attempt at a marathon. The concept was an earnest attempt at a mass review, and it's not really the idea at large that's the problem. It has a lot of potential, but it can only reflect the excruciating amount of time the curator puts into it. Doug Walker, of all people, has been doing this concept for several years now with Disneycember, which he's actually been steadily improving at with each passing year. There's also the long-running anthology series that's drawn close comparisons to Nikorama, but has always been leagues beyond it, Knickknacks, curated by Pop Arena, a full retrospective of every single program that Nickelodeon has ever aired. As far as I could see, Nikorama did start off well enough. Pretty much all the reviews made on 90s Nicktoons were made in earnest, they were fair to the source material, and are generally pretty reasonable. The amount of insight to gain from them was arguably minimal, but they were interesting explorations of paths well trodden from Enter's perspective. However, due to a variety of production-based and philosophical reasons, the quality of the series began to spiral and eventually nosedive with the advent of the 2000s. To me, it felt like Enter was sprinting towards the finish line of sorts. Like, the 2000s cartoons weren't that important to him on the whole, and he rushed through many of them to get to the more infamous series of the next decade faster. I can't speak to the full production timeline of Nikorama, but even before the series officially premiered, there appeared to be some skepticism in the plan. Before the first review dropped, Enter hosted a Twitter marathon of his vague thoughts on each series while he did research for the project. People expressed concerns over excessive negativity aimed at a certain glut of series toward the end of the timeline. Considering the end result, it's a bit ironic that many of the 2010s Nicktoons reviews were getting flack when I find some of the work done for the 2000s cartoons to be significantly more concerning. Here's a totally original and shocking disclaimer. I've been watching Enter for longer than dog years can quantify. There were quite a few times where I doggedly disagreed with his analyses, but at the end of the day, he still earned my respect. Sure, he let cartoons get the best of him at times, but I recognized that he took this medium seriously, and he wasn't willing to let things slide under the pretense of just having a personal preference. Throughout it all, he managed to critique things for the right reasons, or at least with the right conditions in mind. Here, I think he continuously and flagrantly refused to uphold that standard. Here's the kicker, though. It'd be one thing if the series affected were all just your typical bad comedy cartoons that people love to hate. As much as I don't like to see it, something like Sanjay and Craig or Breadwinners is not going to have its reputation changed overnight, though sometimes people will defend them years after the fact. It's an annoying phenomenon, but at least someone will remember them to be better than the rest and be able to give context to the backlash years later. When it comes to your average obscure animated series, an unfair review can be a death knell to its history. For something like The X's, which never got major coverage to begin with, a bad review will not only erroneously put off scores of potential new fans, it'll tell people that these works don't deserve to be remembered, which is, frankly, just horrible.
I'm sure Manny told you how proud he is to honor our ancestors, for when they are no longer remembered, only then are they truly gone.
It's one thing if it's deserved. Sometimes media is obscure or lost for fair reason.
Oh, see, kids nowadays.
But it's a whole other ballpark if it's not. In an indirect way, I could imagine archivists having to make tough choices between series and having to choose based on the will of the people. And if such a unified statement does not exist from a fandom, the next best thing would be the critics that keep its legacy alive. A lot of that's theoretical, and it's totally fair to see that it's just conjecture, but point being, people turning away from good series based on bad reviews is something I've come to see time and time again, and this time was just too much for me to take idly by. I conceived this idea shortly after the X's review, committed to it after the El Tigre review, and royally doubled down with collaborators after the Rise review, where I'd come to the consensus, with many others, that this, along with several other reviews, were egregiously unfair. I'm not here to break down Nicorama bit by bit or roast Mr. Enner for eons. When I thought of this idea, my main goal was to give these Nicktoons another chance, but yeah, I totally get if that wasn't communicated in full. We went in pretty hard at certain points. But I'd hope that in our inexplicably passionate and long-winded appeals that we can convince a small fraction of the audience to give these shows a shot afterward. While I barely care about Nickelodeon in its current form, its past works deserve to be discussed and remembered the right way. I'll definitely try to debunk at least one or two of his points for each show, but this is angling to be a really passive-aggressive appreciation video. With friends. There's 8 of us covering 10 or really 11 Nicktoons we agreed got the shaft the most during this series. We've got them ranked roughly in order from least to most egregious, and we've also got some dishonorable mentions prepared too. So, without further ado, let's crack open the case of the mysterious, messy marathon. The first entry we have is not even really a critique of the original review, but more so a glow-up of the subject. Enner had given Kablam a generally favorable review that praised its charm and the unique dynamic between Henry and June. The only reason why I even thought to include this on my shortlist was because of the review, or lack thereof, in the video designated for Action League Now, which was reserved for bitching about how the spun-off syndicated slot dedicated to the segment didn't produce any new episodes during its run. That's where my first guest comes in. Cash is a reviewer that specializes in everything old school. We grew up on a lot of the same materials, but he has a way more vivid repository for those memories than I do. He's the only one in the club that could talk about Fantastic Max in earnest and give you a major case of FOMO for missing out. Plus, he's a Toku nerd, which is an instant plus. So having grown up with fond memories of Kablam, it was the first entry gravitated towards, and it was easy for me to allow it, on a certain condition. When Enner was trying to rationalize the Nicorama experiment in DeviantArt journals, he actually said that these reviews were not meant to be analytical in nature later on, implying that they were rather quick and dirty thoughts on the series at large. It would have been fine for this to be a series of first or next impressions in some cases, but that's definitely not how these were originally presented. Also, to insist that a review is not analytical in nature when that typically is interchangeable or fits within the most basic definition for a review is quite ridiculous. So Cash is going to do what Enner did, but better and in a little less time, as it tests that you can make an analytical yet sentimental piece dissecting what makes Kablam great in a few words. Consider this the grand palate cleanser before we hop into the real beef. So, let's jump into it.
Congratulations on your wedding, Helen and...
Hey, pound cake. Get it?
Kablam is a show that's had a huge impact on me, not just because of its animation, but who I've grown into as a person. In my honest opinion, the original Nicorama review had a lot of stuff I agreed with, but I wanted to expand on some of them. Overall, I think Kablam truly couldn't have been made any decade other than the 90s. It's unique because of spontaneous nature, various art styles, and the absurd and often immature humor. It's a living time capsule, and that had a lot to do with the presence of Henry and June. Now, it's not hard to guess that Henry and June sold Kablam to the point where they were actually used to promote blocks and shows outside of Kablam itself. They were pretty popular in their time. It does go to show that many of the episodes that I remember in the back of my head, I remember for the Henry and June segments. Most important one to me is Won't Stick the Most Down to Work, in which Henry quits the show because he cracks into June playing one too many pranks on him. Henry seems to have a fine life in the restaurant business, while June is starting to keep the show afloat on her own.
Action fries now!
Either way, both of them miss each other a lot, and when they finally reunite, it's genuine. There are many bits and pieces I remember, which just goes to show how well this comedic duo works. Henry's nervousness as to how an actually now sketch is gonna end.
They're dead meat. They're toast. They're dead meat on toast.
June getting increasingly angry at Henry for ruining her song about Kablam. Henry forgetting their birthday. Both Henry and June going to space or trying to find a real world. Throughout 4 seasons, they covered a lot of ground. It's not surprised that there was an attempt to give these two a spin-off. Sure, while the hosts and the shorts are what make Kablam a unique experience, the personalities of Henry and June are so solid that they definitely could have stood on their own if given a show with more than 2 episodes. Sniz and Fondue is another one of my favorite shorts. There is something about brotherly animal duos of one being a tall blue one and the other being a short annoying gremlin that works. Throw them into any situation and I'll laugh. Granted, none of what Sniz and Fondue faces anywhere near as out there as the regular show.
You guys aren't gonna turn me inside out and eat my brain with mayo, are you?
Oh, of course not. We'll use tartar sauce.
Something I've noticed though is that many of the shorts seem to have a certain duo dynamic. It's Sniz and Fondue, it's Prometheus and Bob. It may be called Life with Loopy, but it's Larry, her brother, telling the story. Characters bounce off each other in different ways and it gives way to interesting situations. Shorts like Sniz, Prometheus, Loopy, and the rest are definitely what comes to people's mind when they first hear Kablam, but they had an extensive back catalog. There's Jet Cat, made by Jay Stevens, who did Tuttenstein, was originally a comic, which just fits with Kablam's nature so much. And others like the campy live-action Race Rabbit, the urban slice-of-life one-off Fuzzball, and even music videos by They Might Be Giants. The magic of Kablam was that it was a showcase of different kinds of animation from different creators. Some of the stuff was so experimental you wouldn't see it anywhere else, and it wouldn't make sense to make it standalone. So why not make it a 30-minute one-stop shop with all this zaniness? Not only that, but the host wrapped it up in a much more memorable package than its closest cousin, Oh Yeah Cartoons.
We're talking about the Action League!
In that case... Are you sure you guys are actually superheroes? Oh no, not those losers!
Of course, there was a plethora of Action League Now shorts, and that definitely made it obvious to make that a spin-off too. And I think my exposure to this as a young kid is why I give Teen Titans Go so much leeway.
Ow!
And I know the mere fact that I like Teen Titans Go is quite a controversial statement, but I mean, hear me out. The idea of superheroes just being complete assholes to each other is inherently funny.
Ow!
The campy nature, the cold tone, the frequent arguments they have, and how they don't hide how they are assholes, it's funny.
Have you guys noticed that the Action phone hasn't been ringing much lately?
I guess it's because we've made the world such a safe place.
They're all confident, their personalities clash with each other, It's mean-spirited for sure, but, it's funny.
Grow up, big baby.
Yeah, I've lost hundreds of victims, and you don't see me crying about it.
I think Meltman is my personal favorite, due to the fact that he has a not-so-subtle crush on Thunder Girl and he always gets rejected.
It's because I'm melted, isn't it? I disgust you.
No, it's not that at all.
I don't know if that makes much sense or not. Are we still using that word?
Ah, my eye!
But Stinky Diver is the funniest by far, at least on the team. The mayor himself is always a delightfully devilish villain to see on screen, and he just steals the show. Somehow the people who work on this short too make it so tightly that it never gets tiring seeing these toys get completely wrecked. While I don't think a show quite like Kablam could be made at any other time, I do think that animation showcase programs could still be more, prevalent. I'm always going to be bummed that the Cartoon Institute didn't probably take off, how Random Cartoons only got one season. But Random Cartoons also didn't have a memorable package, even though there were actually more solid shorts. But you don't really hear people talking a lot about those shorts. I'm more of a Super John Doe Jr. kind of guy, but everyone else just remembers Adventure Time, Bravest Warriors, and Fanboy.
Touchy.
The point is, people remember the big stuff, but anything that's a little bit more obscure, unless you talk about cartoons on the internet, you're probably not going to remember. There's shorts that people still don't talk about from Kablam, but the package that Kablam presented everything in made it a show that simply can't be forgotten, no matter how much Nick wants us to, or legally can't allow us to remember. This show has just had such an impact on me. It inspired me to keep drawing. It inspired me to appreciate the various types of animation art styles and art direction, and how it enlightened me to ska music, and how amazing bands like the Toasters and the Aquabats and the Scatolites and the Mighty Mighty Bosstones and the Real Big Fish and the Planet Smashers and Streetlight Manifesto and
Ska defines who I am as a person, and I will never turn my back on ska. Ha!
I'm getting off track. But the most important lesson Kablam taught me is that it's perfectly okay, especially at a young age, to find yourself drawn to fictional characters. Wait, that's a pun, isn't it?
So when I said there'd be 11 shows on this list, I really meant that I'm rolling with 2 separate series responses in one entry. Why? Well, this entry was rather tricky to produce, and when I went through the angles of which to tackle this one with my collaborator, we realized that there were 2 series that got similarly negative reception from Enter, with similarly weak talking points. Luckily, this guy has an immense passion for both, and his background kind of cements his commitment to even some of the most reviled Nicktoons. Benzie Johnson Jr. is what I would eloquently describe as the ultimate new age cartoon connoisseur. That rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? He did not start this journey as early as some of us did with cable classics from the 90s onward, but he's more than made up for it in his enthusiasm for the new generation worth of content. He's a jack of all trades, basically. He covers anything I would have wanted to dive into on my own. Channel retrospectives, seasonal moratoriums, episode breakdowns, even that sweet CanCon. Beautiful. He started watching Nick largely towards the beginning of the 2010s, but it doesn't mean that he has any shortage of animation knowledge and what makes for a good story, which makes his first case for the next 2 shows all the more compelling. Sanjay and Craig and Breadwinners. Oh man, these dudes were double trouble back in the early 2010s. I think any negative reviews were a bit unassuming back in the day, and many wouldn't consider these bad enough to remember that horribly. For Enter, reviews of these shows were some of his most popular back in the day, and you'd imagine for shows he's known about for so long and is referred back to for years and years that they'd be able to truly disseminate what made it tick, or maybe some new production elements that contributed to its inherent badness. But unfortunately, these reviews still had some minimal insight to offer. Granted, he does admit that he feels there's nothing to talk about, but Benzie's about to blow any doubts out of the water. Even reverse engineering critiques into a thesis about what works in the cartoons, you realize that there could have been a fair amount to examine or consider here. I guarantee you that someone will turn into a Sanjay or Breadwinner's convert, or at the very least be convinced to give a show another watch. Like I said, this is a double feature, which might ruin the flow a bit, but if you were rearing to hear either one or the other dissected, I'll tell you that both responses do share similarities in the criticisms they tackle and what elements they enhance. So you can walk away from one with the other's knowledge, but either way, you'll have heard a differing perspective. We'll start off with the Sanjay and Craig breakdown, since that one's typically regarded as the more well-respected of the two, and transition into the Breadwinners one.
I'm Benzie Johnson Jr., I'm enthusiastic about television, and one of the things I'll defend to the death is Nickelodeon series of the mid-2010s. There was just something special about the way Nickelodeon did things between, roughly 2012 and 2016 or so. There was just a perfect blend of elements in many of the network's originals at the time that was just really creative, really distinctive, and overall, just really fun. Well, we've lost that feeling, among other things. In the scorched earth that heralded in the transitional period of the Brian Robbins era, we can still fondly reminisce about some of the really good days in Nick's recent history. One of the shows that really powered the era, and is therefore really close to my heart, is Sanjay and Craig, probably one of the most interesting, surreal, and unique cartoons to come out in a long while. Sanjay and Craig is not exactly the most positively reviewed show, especially not in depth, so let's just set the record straight about the story of a boy and his talking snake. Sanjay and Craig, on its face, is a simple show, chronicling the exploits of a boy and his talking pet snake, respectively eponymous. The show ran for 3 full seasons, starting in May of 2013, and has the distinction of being the only 2010s Nick cartoon to finish its run without being shafted off to die on Nicktoons, if only just barely, given season 3 was burnt off in strip premieres. Like a number of series of its vintage and channel of origin, Sanjay and Craig has been dragged through the mud by cartoon commentators, misguided and ill-intentioned reviews, such as the recent one from Mr. Error, don't help matters. But really, Sanjay and Craig is far from the show that the opinions of its detractors make it out to be. At its heart, Sanjay and Craig is a buddy comedy, exploring the relationship between our two child characters. Sure, Sanjay has other friends and acquaintances who we see often, but the two of them can also just have an adventure by themselves. The buddy comedy format is not new, but Sanjay and Craig brings to the table an interesting, exciting brand of wacky ridiculousness that makes it stand out from both its cartoon contemporaries and other executions of the core concept. The show is titled after them because it's about them, and like on most shows, the title doesn't say much about the cartoon's overall premise and execution. That's not something that works against it, as Mr. Arrow tried to insinuate in his grating review. Rather, it's just a representative choice, trying its best to distill what it can about the show into a snappy, memorable name. The X and Y nomenclature, as one could genericize it, is something that happens a lot in TV. Even just in kids' TV, there are the likes of Max and Shred, Crash and Bernstein, Victor and Valentino, Sam and Cat, Nicky, Ricky, Dickie and Dawn, though that's a couple of names and then why, and perhaps most notably, Phineas and Ferb, the most successful kids' TV show that just uses the names of its main characters for its title. And that's not mentioning shows where the names are just a major part of the title, like The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody or The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. A show's title says nothing as to how good that show is. Only the show's creative execution can speak for that. Sanjay and Craig, as characters, are on similar wavelengths, but they're still very distinctive. Maybe the overall bro aesthetic clouded Mr. Error's judgment when he was watching this show, but these two are hardly identical. While they're not a heavily contrasting odd couple, which is a completely different set of tropes, Sanjay and Craig are still two different people. Creatures. Sanjay is a bit more realistic and down to earth. While he is excitable and not one to shy away from having some fun, he's relatively chiller by comparison, and he can serve as the voice of reason if need be when things get out of hand. Craig, by contrast, is the more outwardly extravagant and ridiculous one between the two of them. He's exaggerated and impulsive, and often pulls Sanjay along for whatever mess they're about to get into. If something crazy is going on and it's just our child characters involved, chances are it's Craig's idea that got them there. This dynamic between Sanjay and Craig is a huge reason why the show, conceptually, works at all. Craig can bring in the necessary crazy to make an interesting 11 minutes, and when it's time to rein it in, Sanjay is the one who brings it back home, all while keeping the energy high and reaffirming that basically anything can happen on this show. While the buddy comedy is a trope that's been done before, no buddies have done it in the same way as Sanjay and Craig. The show's art style has at times been compared to Bob's Burgers, the long-running Fox animated comedy. While certainly you could make connections, especially in some of the character designs, the show's creative direction goes far beyond that. This is especially evident in the background design and the overall creative direction of the show's physical world. Distinctive lines are complemented by a multi-tone color style topped with visible splotches, wire marks, and superfluous slabs of contrasting, brightly colored splats, paint-like in nature. The use of color in the buildings and backgrounds on this show seems to fit well with the cartoon's bro-esque buddy comedy concept and the show's rock-influenced musical score. And in case you haven't noticed that score, they literally live down the street from a garage band, which should explain everything. A criticism of Sanjay and Craig from those who didn't really watch a lot of the show, as well as Enter in his video on it, is that the show is somehow reliant on gross-out humor and has no other tricks up its sleeve. If you actually watch the show beyond its early episodes, and especially into seasons 2 and 3, you'll realize that the show has plenty of gags in its humor arsenal. Sure, gross-out humor and butt jokes do happen, but there are plenty of other episodes where such things take a back seat to other ways to get a laugh. Explosions, crazy animals, chicken wing-fueled exploits, and plenty of other wacky adventures abound throughout the stories presented within this series. Another weird take Enter made in his video is that somehow the show is overly occupied with chasing trends. What? What does that even mean? How would that even work? Following trends would be nearly impossible for a traditional cartoon, given it generally takes a couple of years for it to reach your TV screen. This is especially true given the ever-accelerating pace of the internet and meme culture. Shows that try too hard to be hip and with it tend to come off as overly forced and blatantly pandering. How do you do, fellow kids? Sanjay and Craig just doesn't do this. And even if they tried, it just wouldn't be worth their time given how long it takes to make a cartoon. We would have gotten a much worse show out of it to boot. Instead, Sanjay and Craig tries to make their own memorable moments, which they do very well. To some extent, cartoons will always be a product of their time, artistically, narratively, stylistically, or otherwise. What makes a show timeless is not the absence of elements which may hint at or reflect on how things were, but rather how well the show succeeds in its creative execution and how that execution is received. The Powerpuff Girls, Dexter's Laboratory, Phineas and Ferb, or any of the series which cartoon enthusiasts laud would not be the legends they are if it weren't for a good execution of their premises and their viewers remembering them positively in death. A show about a boy genius in a lab and his meddling sister? That'll never catch on. A show about two boys building crazy projects? That's ridiculous! A show about a sponge living in the ocean? That doesn't even make sense! There's never a dull moment on Sanjay and Craig, both in its storytelling and its creativity. However, it got bogged down after its death with unnecessary, unfounded, or just unwarranted flack that congealed and manifested into a generalized disdain over the show. This show got 3 seasons and was never sent to die on Nicktoons. If Sanjay and Craig made it that far, clearly it was doing plenty of things right. An episode that was picked out in particular for ridicule was the early season 1 episode, The Giving G. In the episode, Sanjay and Craig discover an old inflatable gorilla balloon, which likely used to sit outside some local business somewhere in Lundgren. The duo and their friends spend a magical day with this big old inflatable, only to find that the next day, the ape found his way to the backyard of the Dixons, and they're not keen on giving him back. When the monkey's on the move again, cue a wild and ultimately deadly goose chase that, in a weird way, brings everyone together. The execution of this episode is a little weird, and right at the wheel, I'd probably try and stretch this out a bit and make it mean a little more. But some of the more glaring pacing errors can be rectified with a little context. The Dixons are not exactly the greatest or most cooperative neighbors when it comes to Sanjay and Craig and friends, and that's established pretty early, which helps this make more sense. Even as it stands, The Giving G serves well as an emotional episode. It's also pretty in line with the show's general premise as a conduit for all things wacky. It's a crazy adventure where really anything could happen. Certainly a tearjerker is not something that's in the wheelhouse of a lot of episodic cartoons, or even in much of kids' TV in general, given the overall shift to comedy over the past number of years. But props must be given where they're due to Sanjay and Craig for taking on such a challenge and making 11 minutes feel meaningful. Probably one of the more cutting attempts at critique in the Nico-Ra video on this show was bringing up the question of whether or not Sanjay and Craig was memorable. Consider me a testament. In 2013, when this show premiered, I was 14 years old. It was a very formative time in my life. I had really only begun to stretch my legs and grown to the truly international television enthusiast I am today a couple years earlier. The shows of mid-last decade have a very special place in my heart, as many of them explored unique concepts and new directions in bids to define what a new generation of kids TV series looked like. While arguably, my generation, in terms of fitting into kids TV's 6 to 11 demographic, was actually a few cycles back, the age of Zack and Cody and Raven and Chowder, the thing was, you could talk with me about the classics, but I wouldn't feel all that strongly about most of them. The kids TV community online spends plenty of time regaling and hailing over the titans of the 2000s we're all supposed to know and love, and while I did watch a sizable chunk of the shows that drive the modern nostalgia, it's not where my heart is. I can't make an impassioned speech about Ed, Edd n Eddy or wax to no end on the cultural impact of Jetix. It was really the 2010s where I finally felt at home. I made friends through these shows, found fandom through these shows, made lasting memories watching these shows. Nickelodeon was the fort I grew to stand behind, especially as Disney XD delivered less and less as the decade wore on. And for whatever anyone might say about Nickelodeon's product at the time, one of my most favorite shows will always be Sanjay and Craig. It's crazy, it's ridiculous, it's awesome, and it's just downright infectiously fun. Maybe not the right metaphor for quarantine season, but I'm sticking with it. Rewatching some of the episodes to write this was a downright blast, and helped me to remember why I fell in love with the adventures of this boy and this snake 7 years ago. Among a few other things at the time, this show was my life. It wasn't just something I passively watched and put down after a bit. It was something I enjoyed and looked forward to and outright loved. The way Sanjay and Craig did things spoke to many of the elements I would come to like in kids television and would become part of the reason why I still regularly follow it now. When I later grew adjacent to the kids TV commentary community and found out that I was in the minority, that changed nothing for me. I was more than willing to rock my heart and these two on my sleeve and never take them off. In a way, it was through Sanjay and Craig that I truly learned to live. How I truly learned positivity and optimism and how to have fun and how to experience a good story. And there's no number of bashing reviews or critical jeers or baseless remarks that can take those deep, personal, formative experiences away from me or ever dull my love for Sanjay and Craig and what it did and what it represents. Sanjay and Craig may never go down as one of the greats, or share the same breath as Phineas and Ferb, or Gravity Falls, or Steven Universe, or ever take a place in the Kids TV Hall of Fame, or the Animation Hall of Fame. But they're in the Best Friends Hall of Fame, and they're in my personal Hall of Fame. And to me, that counts far, far more than the fickle prevailing opinions of the unlearned masses of Twitter, or crotchety old reviewers long past their prime or their relevance, trying to piece together something resembling a coherent, believable opinion for a quick, dirty, soulless paycheck. Sanjay and Craig is a great and underappreciated show, not only for its importance to me personally, but also for its creativity, zaniness, surrealism, and outgoing exuberance. As the bar for what counts, what's acceptable, as entertainment on kids television sinks lower and lower, Sanjay and Craig stands as a forgotten reminder of the lengths that cartoons, that comedy, that kids TV can go to if it just put in the work and stepped outside the box for a minute. And Sanjay and Craig is something I'll always stand right beside. Ultimately, Mr. R's Nickorama video did Sanjay and Craig dirty. And he did it dirty for really no real reason at all. Sanjay and Craig may not be taking home awards for excellence in animation, but it's not the flaming disaster many in the kids TV space paint it to be. It's suburban, rock-fueled, unabashed, youthful zaniness writ large, with copious amounts of curveballs, strangeness, toilet gags, and chicken wings mixed in. Not to mention the small wins in diversity it made, or the creative triumphs in crafting stories I couldn't imagine happening on any other show, blending the real and the unreal and making both seem perfectly plausible and endlessly interesting, or making a snake, of all animals, fun. Instead of spending time to consider any of those things, Mr. R spent 3 minutes just repeating that the show was the worst, and not even trying to explain how it was apparently so bad, as if just saying it would magically will such a consensus into existence. That's not how a review, what this stunt was supposed to be masquerading as a series of, is meant to work. If you make a point or a statement, you're supposed to back it up. If you hate this show because you came in with a bias about it and were never planning on giving Sanjay and Craig a chance to prove itself in the first place, just say that. from the get-go, and save us all the time of having to hear you waffle about it as you struggle to come up with any kind of reasoning to make your own personal, subjective distaste sound objective and as if the show itself is problematic. And even when he did finally get off his high horse and make an attempt to state something resembling actual criticism, he didn't really come up with anything substantive to say, making his opening hate unfounded. The show's name? Toilet humor? A perceived forgettability? That's all you got? Please tell me how you managed to fool 280,000 people into considering you worthy enough of their attention to subscribe to you. Because if this is the garbage you can muster, I don't think you deserve it. I sure don't think Sanjay and Craig deserve your baseless, fruitless, borderline defamation. And while it cannot stand up for itself in death, or ever, as it's a series of images strung together into a video and sent through a series of formats to land the public psyche, I will be more than happy to die on a hill in its defense. The legacy of Sanjay and Craig deserves to be known for what it was and what it did, not what the hive mind of hollow, air-quoted, so-called critique had to say about it. The stuff Sanjay and Craig got to, both narratively and in general as a show, was insane. And at least I, for one, will remember it fondly for that. Breadwinners is the cartoon that everyone loves to hate. In the eyes of many of Kids TV's opinionated when looking back on Nick in the 2010s, it's no Planet Sheen, but in their view, it's up there. Among those who continue to perpetuate this view is the polarizing cartoon reviewer Mr. Aaron, who took a look at this show as part of his controversial Nick-O-Rama stunt. Honestly, after watching his content, I don't see how he's a credible commentator on anything, much less a relatively popular one, but he certainly did no favors to Breadwinners once he got his grubby hands on it.
Buckle up, duckies, 'cause we got a rocket band, delivering bread, flying crazy 'cause we can. Crazy, crazy 'cause we can.
The show's theme song explains everything you really need to know to get started with Breadwinners. Sway Sway and Badooz are two fun-loving, bread-delivering ducks, and they're taking you along for the ridiculous ride. Sway Sway and Badooz, our two protagonists, are perhaps the first stop on said ride. Sway Sway is, to some extent, the brains of the Breadwinners operation, keeping everything in check and in tip-top shape whenever he's not soaring recklessly through the air in the rocket van they tend to crash into something about once an episode. Badooz, by contrast, is more the personality between them. In addition to being best bap, he's also the comic relief and loves him some bread and some booty punching. While they have differences between them, there are also plenty of qualities they share. Their determination to deliver bread, and when that's all done, their disposition to have loads of fun. Oftentimes, those two things come together, and that's when much of the real wackiness happens. Sway Sway and Badooz have plenty of things they agree on, but they're still plenty distinct as characters. Among the complaints that Aaron brought up in his video on Breadwinners is that their names are dumb. Really? As you'll soon see, that's kind of the point. Breadwinners is a buddy comedy, and it's a particularly zany one at that. But the premise of ducks delivering bread is not what makes this show great. It's how they execute on that premise that really sells this show. Every piece of this show, from world building to plot structure, is made to amp up the quasi, ridiculous attitude that sparkles through every facet of this cartoon. From all the special types of bread, to the vicious pond monsters and occasional foes the Breadwinners face, to the catchy catchphrases and musical tendencies, the show delivers wild and wacky adventures, and the potential for them, through exposition and the development of an assortment of side characters, in spades. How the show approaches its episodes and execution is something that really should be more appreciated. Breadwinners could have easily been a more formulaic show, but to the benefit of the show overall, it thankfully isn't. Frequently, Breadwinners goes above and beyond just the tasks of delivering bread and home life with the Baps to really use bread delivery, and Sway Sway and Badooz as an exploration of the whole world of Pangea, running a full gamut of adventures that may only have a tenuous connection to the main premise, but are exciting stories nonetheless. Whether it's tackling the tunnel of fear, fighting an overgrown pile of dirty dishes, or infiltrating an underground fighting ring, yes, that happens, there is truly no end to the insane possibilities of what could happen in the day-to-day lives of Sway Sway and Badooz. While it may not be packing in emotional or cultural impact, it's not exactly trying to gun for the influence of a Steven Universe in the first place, something I think that a lot of Kids TV commentators hold shows up to when it's not really warranted. Among the more ridiculous accusations, no, I'm not making the pun this time, that Aaron made in his review is that somehow Breadwinners lacks an art style. I mean, have you seen even 1 second of Breadwinners? Okay, maybe not the first couple seconds of the theme song, but have you seen 1 second of an episode of Breadwinners? I don't think we'll see a more thoroughly, heavily stylized show than Breadwinner's anywhere on Kids TV for a while. Much of the show's art style takes its inspiration from the aesthetic of video games, and to that aim, many parts of the show, such as graphics, backgrounds, and settings, are rendered in a pixelated style. But the show goes one further, not only pixelating many elements, but additionally drawing scenes in a largely lineless, bright yet soft art style, with uneven lines, edges, and shapes that look like they were drawn freehand. The show goes even further in uniquely stylizing itself through its relatively subtle use of multiple artistic style mediums. Within the show, many of the unimportant duck denizens the Breadwinners make their deliveries to are represented by simplistic duck designs using realistic textures for things like the feathers and beaks. Of course, they could have just animated the extra ducks, and some of the more extreme or plot important cases they do, but I appreciate that they decided to challenge themselves and expectations from modern animation and create these textured ducks. The fact that they don't stick out within the rest of the art style is another bonus and shows the thought that went into their design. Error attempted to claim this as a weakness of the show, some sort of telling admission that the show couldn't draw ducks. It's called stylistic choice. Is Error going to argue that on The Amazing World of Gumball, their use of live-action foes is an admission that that show can't draw houses or schools or really just about anything besides the characters? I bet $100 he wouldn't, though that assumes he's being rational about it. Why dump hate on Breadwinners for a style other shows are doing more aggressively to no complaint? One of the more derisive criticisms of Breadwinners' art style is that Sway Sway and Badooz don't look much like actual ducks. Instead, it's claimed that they look like frogs, blobs, what have you. Again, it's just a stylistic choice in the art style. Even if that's not good enough an explanation for you, there are other water animals drawn differently throughout the show that rule out the idea that Sway Sway and Badooz are drawn like things that aren't ducks. I mean, their pet jelly is a frog. And she's right there next to Sway Sway and Badooz in many of the scenes she comes up in. You can make a visual comparison right then and there. And if even that isn't convincing of how their designs are a stylistic choice, Sway Sway and Badooz turn into more accurately drawn ducks in one scene of the show to fulfill a joke. I know about this very specific scene largely because it's part of the overnight photo loop on the UK version of Nicktoons.
I can't swim! Me neither! Hey, wait! We're ducks. Oh, yeah.
Enter also decided to call out the show's animation style, claiming the show overuses limited animation to the extent that it looks like the show is stuttering. No. That couldn't be farther from the truth. Again, the show's use of limited animation is a stylistic choice, and when they do use it, they do so selectively so it maintains its impact. When they use limited animation, they do so either for comic purposes or to further reflect the show's influences from retro video games, where, due to the hardware, much in the way of any animation at all tend to come at a premium. Off-base remarks like this just go to show further how little Enter really understood this show in attempting to review it, and ignoring the painstaking and highly evident attention to detail that went into crafting the Breadwinner's aesthetic and tonal style. As part of its aesthetic construction, Breadwinners utilizes a lot of references and allusions to video games, especially classic ones.
Explorer ducks!
The show also takes a little time to create its own slang, like bap and quasi and other duck and or bread puns. As part of his review, Enter claimed that this amounted to nothing more than pandering to what was hip at the time. I don't know if you're still young enough to know what is hip, Enter. You're kind of aging out of that level of awareness. But even if that was an accurate criticism, this show isn't that shallow. Breadwinners uses retro gaming aesthetics as a launch pad into the creation of an outrageous, highly stylized, and super unique world that carries a flavor all its own. The show may use these references, but as you watch, you quickly find out that it is not beholden to them. The humor found inside Breadwinners is also multifaceted. However, Enter felt the need to reduce it in his commentary to supposedly nothing more than a collection of gratuitous butt jokes and trend chasing. Enter fails not only to understand what a reliance on trends means in regards to a cartoon, this show does not have it, and to the general amount of restraint that the show has when it comes to how it uses its humor arsenal. Outside of Badooz and its gratuitous glutes, butt humor is largely absent from the show. Even then, the show doesn't have to rely on Badooz's booty anyway, as the show creates and uses plenty of other means to get laughs out of the audience.
Oh my
Oh, and Mr. Error, if the relatively low amount of butt humor found in Breadwinners pisses you off, then don't even try to watch The Day My Butt Went Psycho, where butts are literally baked into the premise. Or perhaps you can prove me wrong and you can make a decent, substantive review on it, though I have absolutely no confidence that you will. Go ahead, I dare you. Another questionable gripe that Error pulled out of somewhere was that the show's jokes ran too long for his liking. Enter. Have you seen Thundercats Roar? Apparently you have as of the time of writing, but have you seen how they string out their one gag per episode on Thundercats Roar? Because that's how you kill a joke. Take it from me, I kinda wrote the review to define all reviews of that show, before you decide to play Johnny Come Lately and throw out some tripe about 3 months after it first hit the scene and long after the rage train for it died down.
It's one thing to have a joke that's not funny, it's another thing to just linger on it.
Something that I personally really appreciate about Breadwinners is the time they took to invest in building out the world of Pangea and the world that Sui Sui and Badus live in. There is a multitude and a diversity of scenes, settings, characters, and situations for our two best baps to find themselves involved with, from the uneasy calm of the wide open seas to the seedy locale that is the Lower East Side. In putting so much into world building, the creatives really set this show up for a potential long haul, but they didn't overdo it. They built things out enough to keep things from getting stale, but kept it restrained enough so that the locales and scenarios had an opportunity to recur if a story wanted to. Like most of the positives about this show, Error threw this effort by the wayside, or perhaps just felt like ignoring it when talking about the show, claiming that nothing in the world was fantastical. I don't know what show he's watching because literally all of the world building on Breadwinners is fantastical. That's kind of the whole point. The entire drive behind putting so much effort into world building is to help create and sell the Breadwinners universe as a wild, wacky, and ridiculous world where the show's premise and narratives, and much more, are completely plausible. Things you wouldn't think would go together all that well are strung together very well in this cartoon. Who else would think up bread mines? Or a rocket fan? Or all the funky breads they deliver? Or Ketta's insane inventions? The mark of a great, well-assembled show on kids TV, especially one like this, is that the show sets itself up in such a way that it makes the utterly absurd and improbable seem completely plausible. It is a hard bar to meet for a lot of shows, regardless of medium, on kids TV, and yet Breadwinners made sure to bake its world thoroughly so it could rise into a nice, fluffy creation that's narratively engaging and creatively appetizing. One of the more controversial episodes of Breadwinners is the early season 1 episode Love Loaf. There are many who accuse it of having undertones concerning date rape, and has birthed one of the more unfortunate and so far lasting legacies of Breadwinners, which I can't believe is a phrase I even have to say. Jenny Quackle's discourse. So, in the spirit of completeness as a Breadwinners fan, and because Aaron brought up the episode once again in his video, it is time for the explanation to end all Jenny Quackle's discourse and finally settle the question once and for all. Here is my definitive look at the episode Love Loaf. In Love Loaf, Sui Sui is swooning over his currently unrequited crush, Jenny Quackles. Upon explaining his love to the unaware Badus, the two discover the titular bread, which has the power to make the eater fall in love with the next person they see. However, the bread maker, local all-powerful wise man, warns that the power of love and the power of the Love Loaf shouldn't be played with lightly, and shows how a widespread outbreak of Love Loaf basically destroyed Ducktown in a bygone age. Seizing an opportunity regardless, Sui Sui sets off to find Jenny Quackles so she can eat it and fall in love with him. That adventure ultimately takes the Ducky duo to a girls-only summer camp. Of course, Sui Sui insists that they disguise themselves as girls and get in there so he can get to Jenny. The climax of the episode is the loaf ending up in the hands of the camp's counselors, who eat it and become madly infatuated with Sui Sui and Badus. They ultimately make it out with their lives, along with a valuable lesson that was clearly stated back at the start of the episode. The ultimate point of the episode is that love makes you do crazy things, and as the bread maker explains early in the episode, you really should just let it happen naturally rather than trying to force it. While I see how the Love Loaf and its effects can suggest or allude to coercion, as it's pointed out early on in the episode, coercion as seen through the Love Loaf, and coercion in general, if you want to extend it out, is dangerous and not to be messed with. Even if you were to extrapolate Love Loaf into a real-life allegory, the show takes extra steps to reiterate why this would be something you shouldn't do, though the implied analogies are kept subtle enough for it to still be believable and acceptable as an episode of a cartoon on a major kids network. Also, the bread only makes you fall in love with the next person the consumer sees, and nothing else. That doesn't mean its powers go any further than that. Thus, it could be argued that the whole idea of Love Loaf as an insinuation of potential date rape is based in a very fundamental misunderstanding of the Loaf's effects. I feel that Jenny Quackle's discourse, long drawn out and overplayed as it is, reads too deeply into the story Love Loaf is trying to present, and in doing so both misses the entire point of the episode and creates needless discourse for the sake of needless discourse. Additionally, it's likely that the purportedly questionable nature of Love Loaf likely soured the taste of breadwinners in many potential viewers' mouths, leading to an ill-informed and unsubstantiated furthering of unnecessary negative discourse over the show as a whole. It's a shame that dumb drama like this turns people away from watching and potentially enjoying a show with wonderful world building, superb storytelling, and just a generally fun, ridiculous atmosphere. A running theme throughout Enter's lengthy glance at breadwinners was complaints about the show and its relation to realism. Perhaps it was most encapsulated in his need to offer a reminder of the fact that in real life, ducks don't actually eat bread. So? If that's your complaint, then I don't think you truly understand what Breadwinners is at its heart, or what it's going for stylistically. This whole entire cartoon, from its artistic direction to the characters, to the settings, to the plots, to the execution, is a tribute to ridiculousness. It's packed with some of the wackiest stories ever told, and it's unbelievably creative in getting to those ends. As Aaron himself pointed out, these misnomers exist everywhere. Cats and milk, mice and cheese, rabbits and carrots, so why single out ducks and bread? I don't see him excoriating Tom and Jerry, though perhaps that earned him more ire than he's already gotten. Calling out breadwinners, or almost any cartoon really, for a tenuous at best relationship to realism is a dumb and weak argument that doesn't really relate to any of the merits present in the show. Shirking realism is an inherent part of animation, freed from the physical constraints of live-action television and its actors and physics and labor laws. Animation has carte blanche, or perhaps écran blanche, to do, ultimately, whatever it wants. A cartoon's connection to reality is solely upon the creative talent of the show. That's why we can have Craig of the Creek and Space Chickens in Space in the same medium. Even shows which are a bit more tethered to realism, like Craig of the Creek or Codename Kids Next Door or whatever, have elements of unrealness to them. Kids creating a complex hideaway society in nearby nature or running suburban spy ops are hardly realistic. Despite the fact that the show's settings and trappings are otherwise pretty believable, it's not necessarily right, or fair, to single out breadwinners for something almost every cartoon does to some extent or another as a means to have an interesting premise and exciting narratives. So give this show a break for its decision to lean towards the absurd. Honestly, Enter, if you want realism, maybe animation isn't the medium for you. Heck, maybe kids TV isn't the medium for you. USA's endless reruns of SVU are that away. Among the more biting statements Aaron threw at breadwinners was that while the show was high rating in its time, no one really talks about it anymore. That statement seems to lead into a bigger, actually honest question about the show's staying power. Has the show aged well? Was it really forgotten by the tune-consuming populace, or has it just been so constantly marred by hate and discourse in depth that we've come to treat it more as a forgotten show? The thing is, this show doesn't really have anything in it that would cause it to age poorly. There aren't any very specific references to things of the mid-2010s that would really date this show. While all shows are, to some extent, products of their time, most shows don't really care about exploiting that. Rather, they care more about building a unique world and telling great stories that can stand the test of time. If we collectively give it a chance, Breadwinners can go down positively as one of the most well-developed, super stylized, downright crazy, and seriously fun shows to come out of the 2010s, and I think it deserves the opportunity to truly be judged on its merits, not the ill-willed opinions of its detractors. The problem I really have with Aaron bringing that up is that he's trying to paint Breadwinners as unpopular when it wasn't. It got 2 seasons and it wasn't shafted to Nicktoons until the back half of the second. Given some of their other shows, even ones which got just as much attention as Breadwinners did in its time, weren't even able to make it through their first seasons before Nick sent them off to their side channels for a dishonorable discharge. I'd say that's pretty darn good for Nick. During its run on the main channel, the show's ratings never dipped much below the million mark, and regularly in the show's first season, the show hit 2 and even almost 3 million viewers. Do you know how many heads of state Nickelodeon would kill to get almost 3 million viewers on any of their shows these days? is a sizable number of them, and I know where they can start. However, in the years since the show's finished up, the memory of Breadwinners has been tarnished by bad takes, uninformed critiques, and really just a lack of appreciation for what the show actually was. Especially in the online community of cartoon commentators, there's seemingly been a concerted effort to forget about Breadwinners and minimize its creative achievements, not even giving it credit for the things it does well in favor of playing out the same complaints and the same overdone arguments about the Jay Quackles thing for the millionth time. And for a network that already gets enough flack and ignorance from online cartoon fans, as they'd rather continue to jump through hoops to justify and apologize for the ongoing failings of another network, that doesn't really bode well with regards to keeping the show's memory alive, or at least letting it be remembered fairly. When attempting to create content about Breadwinners that somewhat resembled what the rest of us call a review, Mr. Error somehow managed to miss completely everything that was important about the show. Instead of trying to fairly criticize the show on the merits and downsides it has, he instead went on a random rant about nothing really in particular than a nebulous past experience with the show and perpetuating the Jay Quackles discourse for another few years for good measure. As a fan of the show since it came out, I wholeheartedly disagree with Error's assessment, or attempt at an assessment, that there's nothing there when it comes to Breadwinners. To make that claim reveals he must have watched the show, or occasionally glanced at the few episodes he had on in the background while doing other things, with his eyes closed and his ears plugged. Breadwinners as a show has so much to offer. Complex world building, fun and absurd storytelling, humorous characters, and a well-crafted and unique visual language unlike anything that's come before or since. There is so much one can come to like about Breadwinners if you gave it a fair and honest chance to impress you. Enner was, ultimately, not willing to unshackle himself from his previous thoughts about the show and the bad takes which have sprung up since, and give this cartoon an honest, substantive review that not only reflects, but understands, to begin with, what this show is about and what this show sets out to do. It is not this cartoon which is lacking in substance, as Enner gutlessly claimed, but it is his review, not to mention Nico-Rama as a whole, and ill-informed, unnecessary, and ruthlessly perpetuated discourse about Breadwinners that is baseless and unsubstantive. If Enner doesn't even understand what Breadwinners is, and makes no effort to do so, believing it's easier money to say nothing truly critical and repeat tired cold takes that have been reheated endlessly, then there's no way he could have made an honest, accurate, or substantive review. Given that, this review was never going to end well, and it's just a shame that it had to happen to such a great, creative, fun, and underrated cartoon. Though it's not the only one he's attempted to scorch lately. I encourage you to put down your preconceptions about Breadwinners and anything unsavory you might have heard about, and then honestly get a taste of it yourself. There's plenty you could find enjoyable, from the fun stories to the meticulous details and expansive world building, but you'll never know unless you're willing to open yourself up and stuff some Breadwinners up in your beak.
Now, for this entry, I was surprised we even had to tackle this one. For as much as I didn't have an interest in Harvey Beaks, I can respect its presence for being the great tonal equalizer of Nicktoons at the time. The Nico-Rama review seemed to wildly misinterpret the tone of the show and its goals, so to fix that I had to give it to someone who understands Harvey on a deeper level. And that's not because he's another duck. Mr. Nostalgia is the only animal in this outfit that goes beast mode on some of modern animation's most neglected topics. From Yo Yogi to Rugrats, preschool days, to even the Boomer Action Block, his channel's a grab bag of animated goodies for us to look at, including his own Harvey Beaks review. Nostalgia's been following Enter for a while too, but I was shocked to hear his insights into some of these reviews. Maybe I shouldn't be, because unlike Enter, he actually has the good takes about Thundercats Roar. While this segment was a bit more tricky for him to put together, we realized that there was a bit to talk about when it came to the review itself.
Oh, it's my turn? Sweet. I am a big fan of Harvey Beaks, and I feel like you misinterpreted a couple of things about the show. For starters, yes, I agree, Harvey Beaks definitely has a much more wholesome tone than a lot of Nicktoons. However, I was perfectly okay with that. I mean, take a quick look at some of the other Nicktoons that were on the channel at the time. specifically these three. In my opinion, Nickelodeon at the time needed a show like this. These three cartoons, besides the fact that they weren't very good, all shared some of the same traits. I think a cartoon like Harvey Beaks put some balance into the network. That's how I viewed it, at least. One thing, however, that I feel you definitely got wrong was the main narrative of the series. Deli brought out a good point while we were discussing your video. Imagine getting mad at a hot dog because of how bad it is at being a pastry. That's dumb, stupid, and overall just doesn't make any sense. Similarly, I feel like you misinterpreted the main idea of Harvey Beaks. You stated that Harvey Beaks was trying too hard to invoke a sense of childhood nostalgia. I'm gonna have to stop you right there. Those words sound like they're coming from someone who's only seen like 7 episodes of the show. And considering you have a history with not finishing the shows you talk about, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. Yes, Harvey Beaks has elements of childhood nostalgia in it, but that's not the main plot of the series. Harvey Beaks is about a 9-year-old bird that is constantly attempting to try new things and truly experience the world around him. The show often has episodes about Harvey specifically doing things that are out of his comfort zone. That was clear to me while watching the first 10 episodes of the show. And saying that nothing goes wrong in Harvey Beaks, and the show has simple plots isn't necessarily true. I mean, there are episodes where Harvey genuinely gets in trouble. And there are episodes with complex situations, at least for the show's standards. These 2 episodes here are the first 2 that came to mind while writing this, plus there was also the finale, which of course featured his 2 best friends moving away. Considering friendship is one of the main themes of Harvey Beaks, this is just about the worst thing that could happen in the series. Unless they, I don't know, decided to take the bridge to Terabithia route and kill off Fee.
She's not even dead, you're lying! Jess!
Harvey helped people, learned important life lessons, got into trouble, and at the end of it all, saw his best friends in the entire world move away. Even though it wasn't the main focus, Harvey Beaks depicted childhood in a much better way than you make it seem. And that is what I feel you misunderstood. But hey man, at the end of the day, it's all love. Humans make mistakes. And if you're watching this and you still disagree with me, that's fine. I'm at peace. That being said, what I'm about to say may come off as a little mean, but I feel like it needs to be said. You should seriously care more about the quality of your videos. What I mean by that is get better editors, because stuff like this isn't going to work.
I just don't get it. Why isn't he here?
What was the purpose of this? First, it's a random scene, then, it's a random bumper, then it's the theme song, except whoever edited it very, very poorly. If the purpose of that intro was to introduce the show they were talking about, they could have easily gotten rid of the scene, gotten rid of the bumper, and use only the final 10 seconds of the intro. It would have looked way better and would have gotten its point across. It's not like you have 2 subscribers. You're one of the biggest animation channels on the internet. You should care about how your content looks. The absolute worst part about your review is the fact that it seems like your editor actually stole some footage from Alpha J's video on the show, and didn't even bother cropping it. That's unacceptable, and you shouldn't have let that slide. Again, sorry if I sound like a jerk, but it needed to be said. Take care of yourself. Stalge out.
Going back into the Wayne to judge what kind of hit job was done inside it, I recruited an extra hand to tackle this review. He's the only content cop this point onward rounding back in his video to assess another review, because let's just say he's got 1,001 thoughts on Mr. Runner and his review series. Man of 1,000 Thoughts was the main person I asked to be a part of this back when this was a much smaller video concept. Aside from him donating time to help with this along with everyone else, he's basically been my rock all throughout. Anytime a new Nikorama came out and was feeling some type of way about it, guaranteed he'd be the first one to jump on the problems with it. He came to the table thinking the exact same absurd criticisms and statements. It was like we had soul resonance or something. It was amazing. Beyond that, watching him rip into Enter in his 6K Q&A, go sub by the way, brought me an obscene amount of giddiness.
Not doing enough research, not watching enough of the material to really give a proper critiquing of it, and he just showed how much he just does not understand the process of animation and what goes into it. You know, like in his regular reviews, he's had down-to-earth and reasonable criticisms even when raging over the worst of them. Like others you'll hear from, man classifies himself as a former Enter fan, and the advent of the recent review series certainly didn't help matters. He's going to dive into another Nicktoon review that was a partial catalyst for this one existing. One that was one of the most contentious of the lot. But for now, let's see how he can welcome us back into the Wayne. Welcome to the Wayne is definitely a Nicktoon that got the short end of the stick. Often considered a Gravity Falls ripoff, which it's not, it managed to stand out among current Nicktoon fodder by having the more unique premise. That being a group of siblings and their friend explore the crazy supernatural phenomena in a hotel. It stayed with this idea for a few episodes with a hint of a bigger story brewing in the background. Story came to full fruition a little later on in the first season and managed to wrap things up in the second and sadly final season. The only thing that made it stand out was its more off-kilter humor and dialect that made for it to be a more timeless in its execution. Caroline, Ollie, and Ancy were a dynamic bunch that came across a dynamic cast of characters, whether it's a spoon-wielding vampire hunter psychics or actual vampires. There was some fun uniqueness to the series. The show wasn't using any modern slang like some hacks Enter will make you believe.
Excuse me, we're lost. We're looking for the exit.
You get a better answer if you talk to my face.
Oh, sorry.
Hey, I can give directions too.
You tell him, that guy's own butt. I got this! I don't got this!
It definitely had a niche to it that's not for everybody with how off-kilter it comes across, but it holds its own as a show that can withstand the test of time.
Not gonna lie, this entry is going to be pretty spicy. It mirrors the exact kind of energy I had when I first saw the show's review, and while he'll occasionally throw out a spicy meme and fire us up over cursed imagery, this person really knows how to keep a cool head. Chilixion is one of the funniest guys I know out of our little outfit. He's a young'un, but he's seen lots of things during his time in internet fandoms, and he came to us bearing supreme knowledge and major power scaling abilities. He was one of the last few peeps to hop on this project, but once he got to check out the source material and really started to dig it, I could feel the heat rise into the challenge of defending the X's. The X's Nikorama was another example of over-accentuating perceived negative traits, when in reality all we were hearing was that it was too cliche and too boring. After screening a grand total of 2 episodes. Yeah, the arrogance presented here really pissed me off back in the day. This is that textbook obscure oddity that got steamrolled in the process of this marathon. I can't say this one's a masterpiece, but the indignation in the face of having to watch the little that he did was high-key disrespectful. Anyway, I'm gonna let my man Chill condense my gripes with this one in a language maybe Enter can understand.
Mr. Enter. The mysterious Enter. It seems like during your little Nikorama thing, you attempted to give an analytical or at least slightly objective critique of the obscure and rather underappreciated Nicktoon, the X's, and it seems you did it. Half-assed. Yeah, you see, Enter, to review a show, you need to actually watch the entire show. And before you come at me with your excuses, it's not like that was your only problem. As a quasi-popular internet reviewer, you need at least a little bit of professionalism. You need to realize not everything is black and white. To truly see how a show like this fails, you first need to pinpoint what it was trying to accomplish, and even what it did well. But I see that with your monkey brain, you couldn't really do it, so hey, I'll do it for you. Let's begin. The X's is an American Nicktoon that deconstructs the concept of the spy family, focusing more on the family than the spy. And it hurts my brain when people say, It's like The Incredibles, but they're spies. Because the X's are nothing like The Incredibles. At all. The Incredibles movie is about a family of superheroes who can't use their powers and learn to grow as a family, move on, and accept themselves. While The X's is a comedy cartoon with no message at all. Which is okay. Not every show needs to have a deep message or whatever. It's really just a simple comedy, nothing to write home about. But let me take some of my own medicine and figure out why Enter's review didn't work. Throughout Enter's review, he mentions only a few main points. 1. That the characters do nothing spy-like. 2. That the voices are too recognizable. And 3. That the characters are memorable. Mind you, this man only watched 2 episodes. I love to give benefit of the doubt, but not today, dog. So you're telling me this grown man, with multiple editors, and what I assume friends, never thought to ask them, hey dude, got any sites where I can find these cartoons? But hey, let's be nice and assume he has no friends. These points still don't work. Heck, I'd be surprised if you could remember these characters' personalities after only 2 episodes, with just one of them having to do with the entire family. But hey, he's right on some points. These characters are very basic stereotypes on the surface, but maybe that's the f***ing point. Look, I'm not gonna yell at him because he doesn't like it. He has his own opinions, and I understand that he's tired of seeing the typical family tropes, but he can't act like it's a flaw on the writer's sake. Saying that using stereotypes in a show where the whole point is to look at these crazy spies and see your average suburban family is a fundamental misunderstanding of how writing works. Trust me, I know that all of this is Enter's opinion, but the fact is, you need to be at least a little objective in your reviews. Mind you, when I say objective, I don't just mean stating facts. I mean looking through the lens of an artist, looking at the goal of the show, the goal of the art. Enter makes constant claims that the show does cliches and that is typical, but it fails to tell us if it's done well or not. Remember, there's a difference between cliche and bad. Just because it's done often doesn't mean it's done poorly. It's like if a child said he hates Call of Duty, and when he's questioned on why, he claims, because there's too much shooting. Like, dog, I don't know if I need to tell you this, but that's what it's about. I mean, it didn't send a surprise package, did they? He's constantly saying things and not following up on them like he expects us to nod our heads like we get it. Nigga, you need cohesive thoughts. You're not a baby, you're a grown man. See, Mr. Enter is not a good reviewer. That's just a fact. He's just good at saying words and hoping that his mentally distant fanbase won't dislike the way he said them. You want an actual review of the X's? Here, an actual review of the X's. The X's is a comedy show about a super spy family and the hijinks they get into while trying to balance their normal and spy lives. As a comedy show, it's not the worst. It got a few laughs out of me because of its quick pacing and stuff. One of my favorite characters is for sure Glowface of Snafu. I just love villains who suck at being villains. It spends a lot of time on the family, which I appreciate, seeing what different kinds of stuff they can do with their spy gadgets and all. The art is also pretty unique with the no outlines and crazy shading. The show's not for everyone and plays to my type of comedy. See how easy that is? I didn't have much to say, so I didn't act like I had much to say. Anyway, 6 out. What do I say normally?
It seems like we're making good time so far. I'm surprised. Apparently the next person to tackle a review is... me?
Oh man, I've been working on this collab for weeks now, and I don't even know what I want to cover yet. Unless that's to be. That's it! Oh man, I gotta hop into the editing bay. This is gonna take forever to finish.
Next up on Dragon Ball Z Kai, a spirit bomb of passion, the detective makes a break in the case.
So coincidentally, I got to discuss this and another show credited to the brilliant Butch Hartman. You can try to pick the obvious answer, but there's like 2 other options to go with that could have legitimately made the list, so just roll with it, alright? Right now, my job is to back one of my own. Truth be told, I was pleasantly surprised by the sheer amount of people that came out to defend Tough Puppy, or at the very least decry the original review. Don't know why this review is the one, because it featured an attribute that had been present throughout for a while. The decrying of alleged cliché elements was the theme I found most reoccurring throughout Nikorama, but when applied in this case to a fairly brief 4-minute review in a 6-minute package, people were really dissatisfied with that final product. Before I dive in whole hog, I do have to recuse myself for a minute. I am an ardent fan of the show, and despite growing up watching all 4 Butch-Nick collaborations, this was the one I probably had the most fun with. Now, I recognize that this wasn't a particularly well-liked Nicktoon for its time, and generally, those seem to be less likely to invoke a negative reaction. Despite the scant material to work from, I think that there was more than met the eye when it came to the backlash this one brought. The crux of the issue, I guess, would be writing off many of these series for one of their flaws that annoyed Enter the most, but this one was an enigma to me. Like I said, this one is fairly shorter than the others, and for good reason, but even within those bounds, the review was thought to be one of the most repetitive ones of the whole lot. Maybe because it was so short that people took notice, I don't know. Its length managed to concentrate the amount of repetition while also highlighting how much nothing some of these were composed of. Truth be told, there are a few segments that feel more like Enter's pandering to his fanbase who wanted to hear him tear into Pig Goat Sanjay the breadwinner, but Tough Puppy proved that there were things that we all got bored of. I don't deny that Butch Productions can grate on the ears a little bit, but from a historical standpoint, this was not much different than what we've always had. I don't know if I can take stock in arguments that start with modern Butches like this, or the later shows showed a decline, because I think the differences between all his works was subtle, but not groundbreaking. Subjective preference versus objective flaw is another recurring theme throughout this marathon, and it goes without saying that most of his products would have never appealed to Enter in the first place in their most extreme states. It only served to aggravate him.
Here comes a thought.
Saying that something is cliche and boring without actually exploring what makes it cliche and boring turns out to be quite cliche and boring.
Groundbreaking.
Anyone with a few minutes of experience on TV tropes can probably identify something that's been done before in their favorite piece of media. But you actually have to know something to break it down and talk about why, in this instance, it didn't work. We throw around words like tropes and cliches now like they're candy, but plenty don't even know the difference between a trope, a cliche, a device, and something else entirely. You don't need a master's in film criticism or media studies to be able to do it, but you do need to think about the history and impacts of the device at large. Tough Puppy was not meant to be a multi-dimensional epic, and that's perfectly fine. I don't feel like I'm degrading the medium when I say that. It's totally normal to have animated products created without aiming for the highest heights while making them. I think that's more Butch's style anyway. The only concepts I've seen him make that were a bit above the typical fare were Danny Phantom and Elf Detective. Rest in peace. Hell, common consensus seems to point to the former being more of other people's work than Butch's anyway, but if you count the Backdoor Crash Nebula pilot, I guess it all evens out again. At any rate, most of his babies are simple gag-a-day premises with maximum comedic potential. If you don't think you'll get plots out of a Butch concept more complex than your average episode of Bunsen, and that's definitely more his style. If you've seen any of those pilots Butch puts out nowadays, you'd see that they're just a vehicle for some clean and easy laughs.
Hey Amber, how you doing?
Other than being encased in amber and not being able to eat or breathe, I'm awesome!
Oh, stupid tar pits. I think we're gonna be late for gym.
While some of the jokes can make your eyes roll out of your head, they're rather harmless. If What a Cartoon got a modern revival, Butch could run that joint all by himself and it would still be alright. Even some of his older work reflects these design elements.
Pickles! Proctor! Mint! Duck!
If I'm not mistaken, that's a duck-sensitive pressure trigger.
I got a duck, and I'm gonna use it!
Once you watch them, you realize that nothing's really changed. It's just that his zany sense of humor shifted from being visually driven to adopting more dialogue-heavy setups. Either way, all the gags are very much his wheelhouse, incessant screaming and all.
One sound, one bomb, and you're finished.
I posed a question to the void of Twitter. What makes Tough Puppy good? Or at least, what makes it work? There was a small but varied slate of answers, all pretty fair, but there is a resounding correlation between them that indicates that it was still pretty funny. The characters made it good and the whole thing was just a good time all around. Now, not everyone feels this way, and like I said, the dumb fun can get to people. but to act as if they don't work just because they're overused is just silly. As Chill said in his X's segment,
Just because it's done often doesn't mean it's done poorly.
they're solid devices that will continue to work no matter how much Jerry Trainer screams to the heavens. If there is a brief argument to be made, Enter could have said this. Like, how hard would that have been? I mean, he did it for all of these reviews. Again, it's fascinating everyone hated this one, because at the end of the day, he still gave it a 5 out of 10 for being as bland as possible. They saw right through the tone and backhanded monologuing to see his review was less than what tough was said to be. This entry had me on the edge of my seat for a whole week, because this one came as a bit of a quiet storm. You see, some of us started on our segments faster than others, so sometimes when people actually started to make theirs, you could usually tell. Some mumblings about a random Nicktoon or the futility of Enter would become more of a pressing topic, and needless to say, after very little warning, this became one of my most anticipated segments yet. Good thing we're all still friends here, right? Fairness Joe hardly needs an introduction. When he's not going over the complexities of representation in animation or shitting on some half-baked hot takes, he's tackling Halloween, or bad Netflix movies, or the joys of tokusatsu. He is a G, plain and simple. And he's a pretty chill guy at that. But, as he'll go on to explain, this show had to be covered. Kinda fitting for the best G to come out at the defense of the Mighty Bee. If we wanted to play a game called Saying Shit That Doesn't Provide Any Critical Insight but Will Get Misconstrued by Anyone Anyway with Nikorama, this would be the review to start off with, due to that little tidbit about Flash animation we would come to know and love. Mighty Bee was another show I was fascinated to have seen get the shaft because, despite its seemingly cult classic vibes, it had a lot of defenders this time. No doubt it was a polarizing Nicktoon for its day. I myself hated it when I was much younger, but looking back on it, it was a pretty fun show. Of course it's the type that Enter would take umbrage with. Not only could he not separate his biases here, but he really had to give this one of all shows the unscrupulous title of the worst of the 2000s, which was insane to me, because, damn, it's not even that bad most of the time. You don't think there were other worse Nicktoons? Anyway, I think Joe can cover the rest of that.
The Mysterious Mr. Enter. Boy, aren't you something of a, special case. To be quite honest, unlike many people who critique Enter, I was a really big fan, and then I realized better videos existed and watched said videos instead. It's even reflected in some of my older videos, severely. Seeing as I'm clearly not the first person we got in this Nikorama thing going on, I don't have to give much exposition besides the fact that this is a series our dearest Enter has conceived and where he's been reviewing every Nicktoon. I use that word very lightly as everyone else is because this series quite honestly is pretty bad. It has definitely been a popular series gimmick thing he's got going on, so it's a real shame that it's really not good. But that makes it real easy for me to rip it a new one. As the Mysterious Mr. Enter has said once when struggling to do one of his admirable animation videos, it's easier to tell all the things wrong with the car than all the things that are right with it. And boy, there's a lot of things wrong with this car. It's made a few bad stops. In fact, the whole journey was quite doomed from the start. I've been coincidentally plagued with handling his review of a show I actually grew up with and like a lot. The Mighty Bee is a Nicktoon about an excitable little Girl Scout named Bessie and her many slightly non-mundane adventures trying to be the best bee she ever can be. Really, it's a bunch of dumb funny bullshit and Bessie annoying the fuck out of everyone in her vicinity, but it's played up for laughs. Enter, though, on the other hand, sees it as the literal devil incarnate, and the length he goes to reach the audience to that conclusion with him is like it's like the funniest shit ever. This is probably my best laugh out of the week. What's really funny first is the way that he pitches the idea of the show to his audience is by comparing it to his personal worst episodes of SpongeBob, where he acts as if SpongeBob is an absolute demon. Nigga talking about the Tono episode as usual, and he also talks about how anyone not willing to go along with SpongeBob's selfish desires are punished egregiously. My nigga is SpongeBob. But he uses this comparison to say that this exaggerated, unbearable, hyperbolic description of those episodes is what every episode of the Mighty Bee is like. He also calls it less original compared to some Ed, Edd and Eddy Boy Scout joke. I know he probably thought that was funny, but I don't know how far niggas are supposed to go with Girl Scouts. It's kind of a straightforward thing, you know, get all the badges. So that joke wasn't really necessary. Like, I get it, it's a reference to another cartoon, you do cartoons, I get it, but it's not funny. Script could have been better without it, because he brings it up as some sort of actual comparison and criticism later, which is stupid. He also says that anyone who's annoyed by her antics are treated like the villain of the episode, which is not true. The people on screen are clearly visibly annoyed, and the show doesn't treat them like they're crazy people for being annoyed by a hyper-excitable young girl. He goes as far as to say that this show is the worst Nicktoon of the 2000s, no competition, as if this bland-ass shit was better by comparison. I mean, I understand being hyperbolic is useful when reviewing, but it only works well when you literally aren't hyperbolic for like the full duration of your video, which is every video. It's like his thing. He made a point as if to say that every cartoon at the time with an annoying, excitable main character was trying to be SpongeBob, and that it was like a really dark time for animation. Basically, this video was just another excuse from the stroke his hate boner for SpongeBob, and it kinda gets annoying. Is it because she also has a tooth gap, Mr. Enter? I too had a tooth gap when I was 9, Mr. Enter. Does she give you SpongeBob PTSD? Because it seems like it. He also says that the show seems to have been designed to specifically piss him off, which is funny considering he's really pissy at literally almost everything. He picks at the theme song, which is undeniably a hood classic. He says each individual parts of the song are good on their own, but together are slapped together and annoying and awful, and this is a bunch of bullshit. You're not Anthony Fantano. It sounds fine. And then he goes on to say the same thing about the show itself, which really again doesn't make any sense at all. And because he's having trouble with his critique, he goes straight for the animation, and he starts it by talking about just how good animation in general as a whole is by using hyperbolic rhetoric, only to say, what in God's name is wrong with the animation of this show? I have your answer. Nothing. It's nothing spectacular, but it's fun to look at sometimes. It's not a dumpster fire that you have to ask in God's name why it exists. He says it's like Ren and Stimpy if it was animated in Flash, like it's still 2016 where people who know nothing about animation can freely talk about the animation process. People need to understand that Flash is a tool and the work reflected from it depends on the work put in. Motor City was done in Flash. Stop the cap. There's not a Flash animated style, like he says. And they're not going against the animation techniques they've been using, like he says. I don't even know what that means. Neither does the guy who said it. He then says the pacing is like Looney Tunes or SpongeBob on crack. There should be a cartoon community bingo sheet that has the following. Like blank, but on crack. Something Flash related. And the creator must have been on drugs. Oh, and let's not forget, this feels like a fever dream. I know a certain someone who hates that one specifically. He then mentions how fast-paced shows are good except for if they miss plot points and other things, and elaborates on that using the first episode and the fact that the first episode uses flashbacks for moments we haven't seen before. But it's the first episode, and that's how those type of flashbacks kind of work. He also says the dog has the most severe case of Stockholm Syndrome he's ever seen because the dog still wants to be with her even though she was an ass to him in that specific episode. That's like if I punched Deli in the face and I apologized and he accepted it. Would that mean he's mentally ill? That's probably racist to dogs, but I found it funny to think about. Basically, it's a fucking cartoon, dog. She's a 9-year-old.
Sometimes the episodes take place completely within a simulacra of reality, where the characters have to obey the actual rules of reality. Sometimes they don't, and literally anything can happen.
Maybe it's because it's a cartoon, and that's the point. He then gets hyperbolic about Bessie's drive to earn all her badges in her one-track mind, and compares her wacky antics to, I shit you not, sinking the Titanic, kidnapping people, and being a literal serial killer. Why? Because she quote-unquote lacks a moral compass. It's just literally all hyperbole. And it makes him sound more like the crazy typical cartoon guy than an actual reviewer, which really ain't too far off from what he actually is. Moral of the story? I get that SpongeBob fell off. Get over it like we all did. We get that you don't have much to say about a show like this, which is why videos like this are much better done in long bulk form. Excitable, high energy shows clearly aren't meant for everyone, but that doesn't mean it's a notorious dumpster fire like you say it is. And finally, watch my video on annoying characters in animation. It's certainly more fun than any Enter video, unless you came to like laugh at them like we did. Joey out.
Next segment here would be a highly anticipated response based on which video got the worst like to dislike ratio. Indeed, while due to his Twitter marathon we would anticipate the general mood or tone of this one, we had no idea the extent of which Enter would drop a fat nasty deuce on everything about this show. Beyond misinterpreting his tastes as reason to shit on the thing, we get indignant gatekeeping, moral outrage, erroneous comparisons to Teen Titans Go, and the general malaise that came from seeing this travesty hauled out. But with great power comes great responsibility, which is why I had to bring out the big guns for this one. D'Angelo of Hats Off Media is another generalist nerd of our pack, and his channel reflects that accurately. He does a little bit of everything from thematic analyses to episode reviews to theories, and occasionally a shout out to a more obscure animated classic. Plus, as a great artist himself, he has a small series where he'll redesign certain characters. D is one of the most reserved people in our group, but being there for when he watched this Rise review brought out some type of muted fury I haven't felt. This puppet stick man radiates a dangerous aura. He could probably snap Cell in half now or something. So before he actually kills off whole races of aliens, I'll let him blow off a little bit of steam by breaking down why this review really didn't work.
Hello everyone and welcome. My name is D'Angelo Edwards, host of Hats Off Media and eager bridge burner. Today, we're going to be talking about why is it so dark in here? Intern, hit the lights. I told you pain doesn't go away just because you can't see it. Yes, sir. Alright then, where was I? A while back, I was asked by Deli to join him in his pursuit of debunking some of Mr. Inter's more polarizing reviews in his Nikorama series. I decided to go with Rise of the TMNT because how bad could his review of it be? It's a fairly competent show that proves to be a fun ride. I can't even think of anything too bad you would say about it.
The animation is really, really bad. Really, really bad. Really, really bad.
Oh, hell no!
Okay, so let me start off with saying that I am not completely without sin here. Back when this show first premiered, while I liked it overall, I gave it a lot of crap as well. I wasn't the biggest fan of the designs, writing, or characterizations, but also keep in mind that when I reviewed this show, there was only one episode available. Mr. Inter had a whole season to work with, but to be honest, I don't even think he made it to episode 3. A lot of the things he criticized in the show really aren't there. And while there is the huge elephant in the room of him saying that the animation is bad, let's start off with some of the smaller things he had a problem with. A little backstory first on the show. Rise of the TMNT is another reboot of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise, this time seeming to take more inspiration from the 80s series, which mostly focused on comedy. A lot has changed here from any of the other interpretations, from the family dynamics to the main villains. While strange at first, a lot of these changes fall into place as the series goes on, and it really turns into a version of the TMNT that can stand on its own. I admit that even though I like the show as a whole, I'm not a fan of everything they do. I still think Leo and Mikey feel a bit too similar, and not every joke lands all the time, but for the most part, I think it's a strong show. And I'm saying this as someone who's been watching the Turtles since they've been born. So as a non-Turtle fan, Mr. Inter is definitely entitled to his opinion. However, a lot of these criticisms come from a lack of knowledge, which I find weird since critics are supposed to do research, but that's neither here nor there. Let's start with probably the weakest of his criticisms. He says that the weapons the Turtles use in this interpretation are futuristic and un-ninja-like. These are sticks. These weapons aren't futuristic at all. I don't even see how you could come to that conclusion. Tonfas and swords have been around forever. And if anything, they have a more mystical feeling to them. They even call them mystical weapons. The only turtle with a futuristic weapon is Donatello, which makes sense because Donatello does machines. He's the tech guy. In fact, he actively turns down the mystic weapon he sees. And as for their weapons being untraditional ninja weapons, dude, read a book. Tonfas are totally ninja weapons, as are Donnie's bow staff and Mikey's Kusari Fundo. It's not a yo-yo, dude. Your only point might be Leo's sword, which is an Odachi, which is more closely associated with samurai. But I don't think that's what you were going for with that criticism. And as for them not being the weapons the turtles are associated with, nope, I gotta say Mr. Enter is wrong there too.
Oh, baby, a triple! Oh, yeah!
Leo just went from 2 swords to 1, which he has done before. Donnie still has his bow, and Mikey has been depicted with some form of grapple weapon for a long time, not just here. Heck, even Raphael used Tonfa for a bit in the comics. So in terms of being objectively wrong, this is the place where Mr. Enter falters the most. Moving on, let's talk about his gripes with the redesigns. He mentions that the designs used here would be fine if they were the first ones we had ever seen, and that major redesigns require time to ease into. So, I guess over 30 years is not enough time?
Do I just wait here then?
This criticism strikes me as odd because I would get it if he just said he didn't like them. They took some time to grow on me too, but he says that they changed too much, too fast. When the Turtles have been changing in every single series they've been in. They've never looked the same. And while every design can't please everyone, you should just admit that it's something you don't like, and explain why you don't like it. If this had been back when the first episode had aired, I would have gladly joined Mr. Enter in bashing Splinter's new design. But if you watch the show, there is a reason he is designed that way. Which brings me to his critique of the way the characters are portrayed. In this series, Splinter is not the same Splinter we are used to. He's a bum. A washed up bum, and so his character is designed to look a little off-putting. In the earlier episodes, I can totally understand not liking Splinter, as a character or his design. But as the story progresses, and yes, there is a story, but Mr. Enter casually forgets to mention it, you learn who Splinter previously was and how he became this way. And you actually follow him as he tries to reclaim his former glory. It's a really good character arc, and it totally changed my mind about the character. Mr. Enter mentioned that he's usually portrayed as a wise mentor, and they instead decided to go with a bumbling dad persona. He says that previous versions of Splinters were more unique, but if anything, the wise old sensei trope is even more
Say the line, Bart!
Cliche.
This is why if you're going to make a review of an entire series, you need to watch the entire series. If you watch a few episodes and call it a day, you're not going to know anything. And it's fine if you want to drop a show, but don't act like you know all about everything when you've seen like 3 episodes. He even mentions in a follow-up post how he doesn't think shows should use the defense of it gets better later, and I see his point if you are watching casually. I've dropped shows before because I wasn't interested in the first bits. But as a critic, you can't pick and choose when you're talking about something. He also said that they should have foreshadowed Splinter's character, and they did. He's always watching kung fu movies, and spoilers here, but they're movies of who he used to be. Not every part of the story has to be spoon-fed to you. If you close yourself up to something because you think it's going to be the same as something you hate, well then you might never try anything new again. But enough about that, because I could ramble for hours on it. Another character he had a problem with was April, saying they made her black to seem a bit more progressive, but who cares? Her being black doesn't really have anything to do with her as a character, and April has always been a flexible character. She's been a reporter, a scientist, a high schooler. If anything, Mr. Enter makes a good case of why they changed their character. She's always changing. And though he says that they hang around with her for no reason, have you ever heard of people being friends? It's actually kind of refreshing that we don't have to go through another origin story of how April met the Turtles. And it leaves room for exploring it in later episodes if they really want to. Now, when it comes to a lot of his other criticisms, I can't really complain about them. If he doesn't like the characters or the story, that's fine, that's his opinion. I mean, he didn't even really explain any of the plot or individual characters, but what do you want out of a critic? Legitimate critique?
We don't do that here.
But enough of that, let's talk about an area where Mr. Enter is objectively wrong. He says the animation in this show is bad. And I'm sorry, but I might start sounding a little salty from this point on. So this is a problem I have not just with Mr. Enter, but with animation fans as a whole. So many people don't understand the concept of limited animation. It's a method used in animation to get their point across while keeping the budget in line. And I find it super interesting, because when you do it right, you can actually get some pretty strong results. Anime does this a lot, by using strong posing and camera movements to sell the movement while keeping frames down. And when it's done right, your brain pretty much fills in all the blanks. And you don't notice it. It's the same principle that goes into making comics. And in Rise, it's done really well. Even when the animation becomes more limited, because the silhouettes of the turtles are so readable, and the posing is done so strongly, that it doesn't look out of place when compared to the action scenes. If anything, it serves to show just how crazy things can get when the action cranks up. Mr. Enter says that they should learn to budget better, but if anything, this shows that they know how to budget, giving the scenes that they really want to stand out the attention they deserve. Cartoons have been doing this for a long time. He tries to give Teen Titans a pass when they do the exact same thing. And maybe try not to show some of the show's best animated moments when you're blasting the animation, okay? Rise of the TMNT is a good show, and this is coming from a lifelong Ninja Turtles fan. If you're gonna say that something is bad, especially something that clearly has a lot of work put into it, then you better have the decency to at least do some basic research, or I don't know, cut some time away from stealing pitches to watch at least half a season of what you're reviewing. Deli better pay me good for watching this garbage review. You did this for free, sir. I did what for free?
Alright, now we're getting into the real shit here. This is the entry man came back to do, and to be honest, there's no one better to do this on this list. Even out of myself. You gotta keep a cool head when trying to disseminate this kind of review, and I would dread to do so, honestly. El Tigre didn't even hit me like that when I was a kid, but when I saw this review, I was fuming. I was mad. After this animated atrocity was dumped into my lap. Makes me appreciate the past just so much more. I'm amazed people could even get through it in one piece to make rebuttals to it. Shout out to Jacob below, because his own rebuttal was a masterpiece. Let me just say that this review in particular is batting 1,000 and topping the list in arrogance, heavy preferential bias, misinformation, and general headassery. For as many Mr. Enter memes are out there, I would have never imagined one that wasn't even thought of yet coming to life. Cause this man really said the way you express your culture that you lived through was too cliche for me. That's a detention. I'm calling your parents. I'll see you after class. I'm kind of surprised I'm still here after that. Now, never mind all the people that also resonate with that culture who sign off on how much the show showcased relevant experiences. Nah, it looks too stereotypical. So that means I, endlessly cultured cartoon reviewer with limited experience with the culture, shall write it off as stereotypical. Yeah, I can't wait for that Boondocks review where Uncle Ruckus is put on blast for being too bigoted. Can't wait for that. As a small tangent, of course El Tigre was so successful because of its influence as a distinctly Mexican show. When I was younger, I got a lion's share of content from black creators and the like that put these characters in the forefront. No, I'm not counting all those black best friends. They contributed, but they were not penny proud tier. Stop the cap. Black entertainment arguably only gained widespread legitimacy throughout the 80s and 90s, and animation was not in sync with that progress. TV mandates aside, there was nothing incentivizing the placement of these characters because there was also such a small pool of people that could actually insert them in anywhere. I remember watching a lot of these progressive entries long before I should even remember watching TV. But at the same time, when that was happening, Enter was already an older kid, like going into his teens by the mid-2000s. So of course he thought this shit was already there because one of his most prominent frames of reference would have been during that time. Obviously, he takes this shit for granted, but contrary to popular belief, we did not have 10 billion Craig of the Creeks waiting for us after school. Alright, name some prominent animated black kid that got their own show in the 90s. Go on, I'll wait. Yeah, exactly. Frankly, it's amazing the crumbs and nuggets of great shit we got in the 2000s, but I'd attribute much of that to cable realizing they can cater to whoever now. That being said, though, public TV wasn't exactly lagging behind either by that point. If black entertainment in the mainstream, which by far has gotten the most attention, at least in the United States, was just starting to pop off 2 or 3 decades ago, how the fuck could you make the case that El Tigre featuring this specific culture came too late and was too weak for it to be effective? Alright, tangent aside, Man brought up a good point to back up the show's narrative legitimacy, which Enter also egregiously called into question.
When it comes to El Tigre, it had a more unique approach to the coming-of-age teenage superhero genre, by which I mean the character made more bad decisions than good, by which I say to people, particularly Enter, that say they hate that part, that's the point. The series was meant to go against the norm and have the main character play more to the villain's side. It was supposed to be more out there in its approach to the superhero genre. Manny and especially Frida were not your typical goody-goodies. They were portrayed as having more fun doing bad. That's why the alternate ending made more sense. Oh yeah, that's right, Enter never mentioned the original ending for the show. Basically, it broke down to Manny entering a tournament to gain ultimate power and finally have to make his decision on whether or not to be a hero or a villain. Now, if you had kept up with the series, you would realize that Manny basically is a bad guy with all the bad choices he's made, and the original ending reflected that with him winning the tournament, locking his father and grandfather up, and taking over the world with Frida by his side. This ending with Manny and Frida being evil was supposed to be how the series finale was supposed to go, but sadly, Nickelodeon meddling messed with it and changed it so it was now done through a voting competition, and people voted more or less for Manny to be good, which goes against what Jorge Gutierrez wanted to do. Just basic research into this would let you know this.
Quite honestly, this show kinda just gives lip service to Latin American themes. This show is called El Tigre. It has superheroes that look like Mexican wrestlers, with Mexican accents. But beyond that, the Hispanic themes just feel superficial.
You dumb motherfucker.
Another big stupid of it all is the idea that the Hispanic representation was done poorly.
Perhaps you would enjoy a spot of cheese and a buttered scone, white boy.
Like, come the fuck on, man. You by no means are the right person to talk about good representation of a Hispanic culture. Hell, I'm technically not even that right to say whether it's good. All I know is the series gave a nice taste of the culture without being too alienating to a broad audience. It balanced these cultural elements in a manner that would keep outsiders interested in the show and its characters. Jorge Gutierrez knew he couldn't overwhelm people with his culture, so he kept it simple enough to create a dynamic aesthetic that only this show could pull off. It's also possible that Nickelodeon didn't want the series to go too in-depth with Hispanic culture as to not alienate their audience, you know, because some people don't like it when things feel too unfamiliar. At the time El Tigre premiered, there was not much Hispanic representation for animated shows. Dora by no means counts at all as a strong representation, especially since only toddlers enjoy that show. It's not a family series, obviously. El Tigre is not a perfect series by no means, but it is a series that managed to be more unique to its superhero contemporaries, and no poorly edited video can ever take that away from it. And let's talk about the editing for a second. How do you do this job for 5 years and still have editing that's so bad it looks like it was scrapped together on Movie Maker for 5 seconds? You paid someone money for this, and somehow you got a product a 5-year-old could do 10 times better for a juice box on a Tuesday. You couldn't even get good footage to use, and you even had to repeat the same clips, like always. A lot of us on this platform have been at this less than you have, and we easily have the basic essentials for editing down packed. You get help, and you're still at a lower quality? How you do that? It shouldn't be possible. You have no business coming after anybody for quality when your dumb ass couldn't even...
Before we plunge into the final entry, I want to address these dishonorable mentions. Forming the original list was a fun kind of challenge, but there's still plenty of reviews that I wanted to acknowledge were plenty bad to make the list. Chalk Zone. Based on the content and the scale of the original review, this one was definitely fit to be on the list proper. The reason why it wasn't is because the work was more or less done for us. Out of all the more controversial Nickorama segments, this is the only one I can say ended up reflecting that directly in the comments, aside from the Rise review. Someone I knew actually made top comment for a while, just eviscerating everything wrong with this video. Sure, one of us could probably break it down a little bit more, but I wanted to save the slot for something that didn't get the Chalk Zone treatment. Now, as to how Rise ended up on the list proper anyway, it kind of made me double down on making this. When we sat down and watched several of the Nikorama videos back to back, we agreed that this one was by far the most controversial, so it was kind of grandfathered in. Cat Dog. I think this is the first review of the series I significantly disagreed with. Not only does this entry pale in comparison to later ones, but I do have a significant bias as a longtime Cat Dog fan. It became difficult for me to separate those two poles, and I didn't really feel comfortable putting it there without feeling I could fully justify it. I still feel like it was a loss, but considering what did make it to the list, it definitely doesn't feel like as bad a decision as it once did. Danny Phantom. Depending on which circles you orbit, Danny Phantom is either exponentially overhyped or egregiously overhated. While I enjoyed the show in its prime, it's definitely got its issues, but I'm doubtful that they were ever as big all throughout as people persist that it was. Also, the Sam rant was a little much, you know. As told by Ginger. I didn't feel like the purpose and main functions of the show were understood too well. While we got a fairly benign, albeit unbalanced review out of this one, we got more egregious entries shortly thereafter. Tak and the Power of Juju. This actually occupied a lower spot on the list before I swapped it out for Kablam, if I'm not mistaken. Considering that the review had structural and tonal issues, I did want to tackle it to prove how badly these were mangled, no matter how unpopular the show. That being said, I think that was demonstrated well enough in covering some later entries. Robot and Monster. This review felt almost maliciously spiteful. There's definitely a trend to these reviews feeling like a spoiled kid whining about how many chores they gotta do, and this one's the motherload. It just took a benign, kinda unassuming series and blew it way out of proportion. Kung Fu Panda Legends of Awesomeness. I feel like his approach to the narrative elements of Legends was a bit too rigid, but what would be the point of the review if not to tackle its main draw, the narrative? That's supposed to be his bread and butter anyway. Like the Cat Dog entry, I didn't know if I could accurately separate my personal gripes from objective issues with the review, and as much as I watched it, he probably has a more solid grasp of the story than I did. Barnyard. This one was another short one that involved a lot of bullshit to get through the meager 6-minute mark. I know this one's more known as meme fodder than actual narrative production, but I could find clever bits of Barnyard that you would have had to been paying attention to in order to appreciate. It's not high art, but it's damn fun, and it's a bit tiring to hear it be picked apart for partying hard like it's supposed to. The Adventures of Kid Danger. Like the series and its predecessor itself, this review was amazingly repetitive. I don't know exactly what I'm seeing except a weirdly faithful, albeit poorly animated adaptation of a kidcom, but for some reason Enter insists that this was one of the more disgusting, foul shows on the docket. Like, it definitely had its moments, but it's really not worth all the fuss, which is a philosophy I encapsulated by not putting this video in the list proper. The Casagrandes. This was more or less a sour brown note to end on, and a very muted one at that. I can at least put some respect on his name for clarifying its status as quote-unquote Mexican Cleveland show. Not to mention just the full transparency of his apathy towards it. No grand overtures were made, just a statement that I don't like or care about the basis of this show, and I don't think it'll last too long.
Ouch.
To examine the fundamental flaw of Nikorama is to look inwardly and try to determine how the curator really felt about the process. I can't say with certainty whether this was a daunting task or not, but either way, the whole philosophy of this thing was so messy. We as an audience don't know why this was made, or the full brainstorming process, or even how much passion was really poured into it. In a sense, that's quantifiable by the people who helped put it together. All we can do is go by what we see and make educated assumptions as to what went down. Now, looking inwardly, I can harken back to points where Enter was at his lowest, when he would come into videos downtrodden, wounded, negatively introspective, and drained by anything around him. Certain points itself being harder to listen to than others, but there was a quiet sense of push through that he'd given, even when he was telling us he was at his wit's end or right on the edge of something disastrous. Even when he was pretty much set to give up, there was always something else for him on the horizon. I mean, no cap, this man has gone through some shit, and it would have been so easy to throw in the towel at any point. I don't think anyone would have blamed him either. But even in his darkest spots, he felt the need to shift in the midst of the darkest storm to make for a brighter rainbow at the end of it all.
I can't change the past. I understand this. What I did, I will always have did. What I've been, I will always have been. But I want to be a better person than that. I think that I am a better person. And I believe that I am finding my way upward, slowly but surely.
In going through his past stuff, I do find moments like this poetic, and him continuing to push out content at his best moments easily lives up to that standard. Even if people don't really know what Mr. Enter lives by, wants to do, or even is anymore. The one thing you can probably always pin to his character is his strong sense of resilience. Not exactly bold and brash, but silent and passionate. He's passionate about continuing on, and he's passionate about doing what he thinks is right. Now, taking this whole event into account, Nikorama feels downright antithetical to the whole body of Enter. I have a sense that this wasn't made to just prioritize a bunch of fun reviews about Nickelodeon's lineup. Not like that's an inherent issue anyway, but beyond his personal reasons why he did it, the writing's on the wall, because 9 times out of 10, the passion was not reflected in the reviews. Sure, Enter might be irritated or screaming or dripping with sarcasm, but if you take a moment to read between the lines and analyze what he tries to say through many of these, you'll find nothing. You wouldn't have learned anything new about production, or you wouldn't have gained any narrative insight, or come away with any cool mantras or anything. It'd be one thing if he was just saying the same things over and over again, but it's a whole other to have nothing emotionally behind anything that he's saying.
Alright, let's talk about Nikorama and Nickelodeon as a whole, shall we? Have I been negative at times? Absolutely. Maybe even at points undeservedly so. That might be because I decided to marathon everything all at once. I'm still trying to decide whether or not this was a good idea. Time will tell on that one.
This is peak Enter apathy. A lot of the times the emotional impact a work has on you does push you to do your due diligence and push out a product to pay homage or to eviscerate it for all time. Like, some of these cartoons have been on his radar for the better part of a decade, and he has nothing new or informed to say about him, or a new way to recontextualize his old thoughts. I know these were written in bulk like a month before this thing even started, but hell, with a bit more emotional drive, he could have started 4, 6, even a full year before this was planned. If this had resonated with him more than it did, he could have rewritten some stuff or come up with custom assets or a true narrative or something. Anything that keep people from referring to it as the poor man's knickknacks. But what did he do with this series? Nothing. Ostensibly, the theming is arbitrary, but it's the only thing signifying this as a big happening for this channel. It's a bunch of reviews strung together. That's it. It's not even the full original Nicktoon slate as he promised. So, to me, its combined emotional impact is null, even with all the mind-blowing, wrong, or fucked up parts about this being made. Like, yeah, I hated plenty of the coverage given, but it'll have no net impact on me, and I'm gonna move on from this and make more of my own shit. Unfortunately, his fans went through a hell of a lot more strife over the course of this marathon. Now, I don't imagine most people even getting past the first entry, But if he did, I assume that you know of Enter's late January Twitter exit. Now, understandably, getting shit on for eons is no fun, and the deletion of his account and subsequent journal did adequately voice his frustration. That said, instead of trying to look inward and at least address some criticisms, he turned around, he dropped trow, and he mooned the whole audience from that point forward. He showed his ass in every one of these replies and refutations while not identifying anything people were saying. It was just masterful disrespect. To be fair, he's Mr. Enter. I'm sure he's aware of his reputation, so maybe this is more of an inevitability than anything. That being said, it just feels wrong to talk down to and venomously downplay people's genuine concerns, doubly if these people come to bat for you anytime you produce. I'm not saying his only option was to kiss ass and legally marry all of his supporters. Far from it, in fact. We know damn well not everyone that likes him has his best interests at heart. But something, anything would have been better than nothing. In lies the crux of the problem, right? Everyone was offered nothing to watch, nothing to justify shitty or inaccurate claims in the videos, and nothing to really work with after the fact. He gave nothing. And people had to live with that for 3 straight months. And that feeling, it encapsulates the show that he most fervently accuses of being a big old pile of nothing. The cosmic irony of the Bunsen is a Beast review. The Bunsen review itself was the apex of stock enterism. It is a lot of the problems the previous entries did, and it's his trademark complaints that are amplified. The Tough Puppy segment could have retroactively addressed at least a third of his gripes, but aside from that, if you've seen one overly negative Nick-O-Rama, you've basically seen them all. He rides it for the voice acting, sound design, animation, and art style, Butch's philosophy, and all that. I don't think he even really got to the story. He begrudgingly said that the animation for the show was decent, admitting it looked better than season 10 of Fairly Odd Parents, despite the fact that the digitally animated set of episodes using the exact same studio and the exact same pipeline and the exact same techniques looked the same. Doesn't the crossover kind of exemplify that? I mean, all the characters are on screen at the same time. He doesn't even get anything out of it comedically, obviously, but he justifies it by talking about a general degradation of Butch's skills. I mean, modern Butch on his own, even at Nick, was not his strongest self. But it's generally the same shit we've gotten for 20 years. It's just a weaker package. It's nothing to write home about, but there was no drastic change within Butch to justify this. Then he goes on a tear about Butch Hartman's declining sense of skill and how him pandering to kids created this monstrosity. Which, again, nothing's changed. Also, isn't the whole running narrative with modern Butch is that he's a raging egotist that lacks self-awareness? Them kids weren't the endgame. He didn't care enough about him to pander directly to him. Pretty much all his cartoon pitches are gagaday ideas that allow him to make quick and dirty puns and quips. In a way, they're eye-roll worthy, but they can be a bit more variable than stuff he made for TV. This attempt at a historical narrative popped up a few times in Nick-O-Rama, using certain shows as milestones to talk about where Nick was as a company. That was a major part of the Monsters vs. Aliens review, in fact, coming from a guy who couldn't even be bothered to watch the movie for greater context, let alone more than a couple episodes of the show. A lot of his historical analysis was hyper-emotional drivel based on heavy speculation and a string of loose observations. Related to that, he tried to discuss Nick's horrible proclivity to use standout creators in his network to make new shows. Spooky. He acts as if utilizing the same talent or creative brain trust gets you nowhere, when in reality, it's a network of selection like this that leads to some of the most beloved and respected cartoons of the past decade. Even if we're speaking from the perspective of just using one creator, I don't know how well that still holds up. If anything, cartoon creators do move on to bigger and better things each time they make something. People like Gendig, Craig, Dan, Swampy, they all managed to innovate each time they got a new green light. If we're speaking about the very specific and unusual terms of the same creator staying with the same network to make the same shows, then we also gotta take into account why Nick themselves kept him on board. Creators have immense power, but at the end of the day, it's the executives that have the final say. They pick these people because they trust that their creative visions generally line up well with the networks. More likely than not, they did influence the humor and the story and these other elements to be more streamlined. Enter insists that in past Nickoramas there was a curse, a spooky curse, among Nickelodeon creators that pertains to them losing their mojo as time goes on. As if to say that if one person makes more than a couple shows with varying premises and ways of executing, that shit's automatically cursed. Fuck character development. Shit's cursed, man. Yeah, I don't know when correlation and causation became equal, but I know that still doesn't check out. He also insists that the main premise of the show is unworkable, despite it being a very typical take on the fish out of water story that runs rampant in kids shows with varying execution. I don't know, this review was peak old man yelling at clouds. It'd be, quote unquote, one of those shows made to piss him off, and I think this episode is most notable for showcasing the lack of separation in personal bias and critical perception. This isn't the most defensible Nicktoon of the lot by all means, but for real, it feels like there's so much less holding this one together than the others. It's one of those cartoons anyone can just write off as mediocre in most cases, but Enter has to dig his heels into the sand without justifying the resistance. He picks on basically everything that can be easily explained or justifiable by common answers, instead of just saying, "This show doesn't work for me." He'll go on a tear about how this show works for no one. Again, it's not the strongest show, but these critiques contrast against it are the most weak sauce arguments you could throw out, and the resulting effect is null. There's nothing there. There's no meat on that bone. Like, even a few years ago, if you got the same spiel, I could imagine the shit at least being entertaining. Subjective to an extent, but considering how tired and dated the arguments that these are, there's nothing you cited for Bunsen that you couldn't have heard in a past Nickorama. Maybe that's to be expected because it's one of the last few on the list, but either way, I can't imagine most getting something out of this. Hell, I could apply some of his complaints to his reviews. It wouldn't change a damn thing. Watch. His voice acting is annoying. It seems to be stuck in 3 phases of monotony, and when it doesn't grate on the ears, it grates on my psyche. The writing is horrendous. It's repetitive cliché schlock that everyone's seen and heard before, and it doesn't have anything to show for itself. The written structure is all over the place, but not as egregious as the wavering quality of his footage. Oh, even between shots, the thing changes. That is just unacceptable. What were those animators thinking? There's no musical score, and the sound design feels empty and lifeless outside of Jonathan's loud ramblings. And by the way, where are the morals? Yeah, picking on a bunch of defenseless cartoons really makes you an upstanding citizen. Bravo, man. I really gotta hand it to you. I can't believe the writers actually went there. I'm disgusted. Disgusting. I don't know if you got anything out of that, but cumulatively speaking, I know I wouldn't have gotten anything out of it if I just repeated that ad nauseum for over an hour. I can feel the repetitive nature of this phrase weighing on the script's legitimacy. I mean, the script itself is probably running in circles at this point, but if that doesn't tell you how much of nothing this was, I don't really know what will. This definitely isn't in the vein of my usual content, so I want to end on a more down-to-earth but open-ended analysis. As you could probably tell, there was a smorgasbord of problems and gripes people had with the Enter original series. To me, it'd be difficult to consider one major issue or all the minor ones, considering how many angles there would be to factor in. But in a long-winded way, I can try to illuminate the context for why things ended up the way things did. We as a niche of content creators have come a long way. Look around and think about how much we've evolved. 3 years ago, the most damning and least controversial critiques came from someone in the damn community that could openly proclaim that the niche was chock full of repetitive clout-chasing chumps who are allergic to change and yield their armies of 10-year-olds to attack writers and parrot their 2-bit hot takes about the new Teen Titans Go episode. Also, nobody reads. That was also a prominent point. If there weren't individuals you can name that fit at least one of those traits, at the very least, those behaviors were consistently presented throughout with the narrative that these were just #cartoon community things. Going off the reception of that video especially, I think the reviewer side of the community saw a major glow-up of recent years. It wasn't necessarily in physicality, but mostly in philosophy. Going from that point forward, there was a silent dedication to be more empathetic, kinder, and less negatively charged inside and out of videos.
I started out doing lists on SpongeBob. I transitioned into other shows as well. Now I'm talking more or less about like obscure series, quote unquote. Some of them aren't really, but more or less forgotten, and I want to shed light on them because some of them are like unfairly forgotten. What are the good aspects? What are the positive aspects to watching these shows? And it's more respectful, the way we're handling things, and I like that a lot.
Also, the rise of the feature-length animation breakdown's a bit of a boon, but it did expand the cartoon community's net worth, if you will. Part of that also lied in putting old biases to bed, even biases against certain people previously isolated and singled out, like Mr. Enter. Without a doubt, harassment is no joke, but lumping everyone into the same video was a controversial choice, to say the least. Obviously, there are far degrees in what certain people did, but the fact that Pan's lack of actions were kind of put on a similar level as Turkey Tom's gives me pause to this day. Because despite the man showing abject remorse over not policing his audience and making dumb jokes behind the back of a man who has also not leashed his sizable audience from indiscriminately shitting on writers and artists throughout the decade, long before he was even put on notice, he needs to be called out. Why?
Because potatoes.
Regardless of how anyone felt about the situation, though, almost everyone came together, they apologized or acknowledged wrongdoing, and they made a point to do better in the future. That type of response was almost immediate. It took time for people's attitudes to shift, but it took a little bit of pull from everybody part of the niche to change things for the better. Now people with high-quality analyses are the norm, not the exception to the rule, and the philosophical changes not only improved the community's rapport and potential outreach, but it also kind of improved everybody's content. They just had to make sure nobody went off the rails and called for the heads of writers and morally murdering a cartoon sea sponge for a few episodes. Not even necessarily within the reviewer community, but within the plain audiences that watched the shows and the creators, too. Everyone had to improve, and there was more or less a bare set of unspoken guidelines to assure everybody stayed in line and made sure that everything was awesome. It takes a village to raise a cartoon community, but not everyone has to move in sync. We're still very much our own people, and the beauty of the niche is the ability for creators to have dozens of different ways of telling a similar story. Mr. Enter's production style is more or less set in stone, for better or for worse. There's no reason why that should change. It's the attitude that created this schism in his base. Throughout the course of Nico-Rama, I got to see some of his most ardent and loyal supporters gradually become his loudest detractors. They don't hate his guts now, but I got the sense that they were disappointed day after day after day with the results, much more than they were satisfied. Of course, plenty of his critics on Twitter already disliked him or his work, and took every opportunity to dunk on the trash fire while it was hot. That being said, it was fascinating seeing people progressively get more frustrated and discuss the series' declining reputation in real time. Even after that fact, people would regroup and discuss what went wrong or which videos were the best or the worst. Not long ago, fans considered us in a new age of Enter. Things were popping off and happening at a rapid pace, and it was thought to have illuminated a new stroke of genius at Enter, from the Technocracy series, to the accelerated pace of work on Growing Around, to his takes on Kappa and Camp Coral. While Nico-Rama was a particularly sour mixed bag, it's not the content that seems to have done it in. Again, it's the message. No doubt this was a stressful project for him, one that could have benefited from him taking a few more months to plan and buff out the details. But after it's all said and done, not only did he seem to fundamentally misunderstand the criticisms of people who had chosen to give him feedback, but he actively dismissed them under the guise of them all coming from misunderstandings of his words, or from salty fanboys that didn't want him to speak ill of their childhood favorites. And it all came out most in his wordings, something that his fans pay very close attention to. The Enter that they recognized to have made the Technocracy series or Growing Around or any of his newest works was not the one he exhibited throughout Nikorama. Because that Enter was philosophically more earnest and able to stop and look inward. He wouldn't just explore and contextualize his past foibles and mistakes. He would use them to fuel his fire to pump out his best and brightest work. Looking at these pieces of media from all sides is essentially his job, but all throughout he chose to unscrupulously go in with the blinds on and lay waste to anything he did being seen in good faith. For all the growing he's done over the years, his regression into old habits and similar pitfalls was the most jarring aspect of the series for many. As one of the oldest and most prolific creators in this community, it must have been eerie to see him reflect more of his past self people were eager to get past. I wasn't, because I didn't notice or see most of them as problematic up until this point, but I don't deny that it was for others. There were plenty of variables behind his behavior and the outcomes of this series. I just kinda wish we could go back to that time before. It would have been at least much easier to stomach. Making this video was not easy, and I'm not referring to the scale of production. Hell, getting this out was more fun and less strenuous than most of my other big projects are. But in a philosophical context, there was a lot for me to put to bed in order to make this possible. Even before I put people on this project, I had to more or less accept the consequences of this potentially gaining traction. Possibly gaining tons of respect and attention, possibly making silent enemies, possibly losing opportunities, or indirectly exposing myself or others here to vulnerable positions, possibly even more dire and aggressive threats down the line. This video is like drawing a line in the sand, and as much as I can and will establish the context and conditional boundaries that brought me here, there's always going to be that subset of people that will see this thing at face value, turn away, and never look back. But even if this goes nowhere, and pretty much nothing comes out of it, I will still be pleased to get this out. Like, if anything, this project will probably enable me to go back and enter videos with a clean slate, more or less. It was good to get all this stuff off my chest in a constructive way, and there's no other group of roadies I'd rather do it with. So, remember to check out the works of Cash Cash, D'Angelo of Hats Off Media, Chilixion, Benzie Johnson Jr., Mr. Nostalgia, Man of 1,000 Thoughts, and Veritas Joe. I don't typically make content like this, but if you enjoyed this one, you might enjoy a few commentary-heavy videos I'll highlight. I also have a few more general video topics I'm working on regarding fandoms and animation communities. It's up in the air when those will be produced, but I provide channel updates, animation hot takes, and occasional art on my Twitter. For now, I'm closing the book on this file, but who knows what may dictate we crack open this case once again.